In the mirrored cell of her dressing room, Diane Duval was just about ready to play her scene. "You may come in now, Mr. Litchfield," she announced. He was in the doorway before the last syllable of his name had died on her lips. "Miss Duval." He bowed slightly in deference to her. She smiled, so courteous. "Will you please forgive my blundering in earlier on?" She looked coy. It always melted men. "Mr. Calloway," she began. "A very insistent young man, I think." "Yes." "Not above pressing his attentions on his leading lady, perhaps?" She frowned a little, a dancing pucker where the plucked arches of her brows converged. "I'm afraid so." "Most unprofessional of him," Litchfield said. "But, forgive me, an understandable ardor." She moved upstage of him toward the lights of her mirror and turned, knowing they would backlight her hair more flatteringly. "Well, Mr. Litchfield, what can I do for you?" "This is frankly a delicate matter," said Litchfield. "The bitter fact is, how shall I put this? Your talents are not ideally suited to this production. Your style lacks delicacy." There was silence for 2 beats. She sniffed, thought about the inference of the remark, and then moved out of center stage toward the door. She didn't like the way this scene had begun. She was expecting an admirer, and instead she had a critic on her hands. "Get out," she said, her voice like slate. "Miss Duval." "You heard me." "You're not comfortable as Viola, are you?" Litchfield continued, as though the star had said nothing. "None of your bloody business," she spat back. "But it is. I saw the rehearsals. You were bland, unpersuasive. The comedy is flat. The reunion scene, it should break our hearts, is leaden." "I don't need your opinion, thank you." "You have no style."
"Piss off."
"No presence and no style. I'm sure on the television you are radiance itself, but the stage requires a special truth, a soulfulness you, frankly, lack." The scene was hotting up. She wanted to hit him, but she couldn't find the proper motivation. She couldn't take this faded poseur seriously. He was more musical comedy than melodrama, with his neat grey gloves and his neat grey cravat. Stupid, waspish queen, what did he know about acting? "Get out before I call a stage manager," she said, but he stepped between her and the door. A rape scene? Was that what they were playing? Had he got the hots for her? God forbid. "My wife," he was saying, "has played Viola." "Good for her." "And she feels she could breathe a little more life into the role than you." "We open tomorrow," she found herself replying, as though defending her presence. Why the hell was she trying to reason with him, barging in here and making these terrible remarks? Maybe because she was just a little afraid. His breath, close to her now, smelled of expensive chocolate. "She knows the role by heart." "The part's mine, and I'm doing it. I'm doing it even if I'm the worst Viola in theatrical history, all right?"
Hey, Fire, how you
She was
doing?
trying to keep her composure, but it was difficult. Something about him made her nervous. It wasn't violence she feared from him, but she feared something. "I'm afraid I have already promised the part to my wife."
"What?"
She goggled at his arrogance. "And Constantia will play the role." She laughed at the name. Maybe this was high
You gotta
comedy
break some
after all.
funk up.
Something from
This
Sheridan
one's,
or Wilde.
Gelato
Catchy
Sunrise.
stuff. But he spoke with such absolute certainty. Constantia will play the role, as if it was all cut and dried.
"I'm not discussing this any longer, Buster. So if your wife wants to play Viola, she'll have to do it in the fucking street, all right?"
She opens tomorrow.
"Are you deaf? Or stupid? Or both?"
Control, an inner voice told her, "You're overplaying, losing your grip on the scene, whatever scene this is." He stepped toward her, and the mirror lights caught the face beneath the brim full on. She hadn't looked carefully enough when he first made his appearance. Now she saw the deeply etched lines, the gougings around his eyes and his mouth. It wasn't flesh. She was sure of it. He was wearing latex appliances, and they were badly glued in place. a hand all but twitched with the desire to snatch at it and uncover his real face. Of course, that was it. The scene she was playing. The unmasking. "Let's see what you look like," she said, and her hand was at his cheek before he could stop her, his smile spreading wider as she attacked. This is what he wants, she thought, but it was too late for regrets or apologies. Her fingertips had found the line of the mask at the edge of his eye socket and curled round to take a better hold. She yanked. The thin veil of latex came away, and his true physiognomy was exposed for the world to see. Diane tried to back away, but his hand was in her hair. All she could do was look up into that all but fleshless face. A few withered strands of muscle curled here and there, and a hint of a beard hung from a leathery flap at his throat. But all living tissue had long since decayed. Most of his face was simply bone, stained and worn. "I was not," said the skull, "embalmed, unlike Constantia." The explanation escaped Diane. She made no sound of protest, which the scene would surely have justified. All she could summon was a whimper as his handhold tightened and he hauled her head back. "We must make a choice, sooner or later," said Litchfield, his breath smelling less like chocolate than profound putrescence, "between serving ourselves and serving our art." She didn't quite understand. "The dead must choose more carefully than the living. We cannot waste our breath, if you'll excuse the phrase, on less than the purest delights. You don't want art, I think, do you?" She shook her head, hoping to God that was the expected response. "You want the life of the body, not the life of the imagination. And you may have it. Thank you. If you want it enough, you may have it." Suddenly his hand, which had been pulling on her hair so painfully, was cupped behind her head and bringing her lips up to meet his. She would have screamed then as his rotting mouth fastened itself onto hers, but his greeting was so insistent, it quite took her breath away. Ryan found Diane on the floor of her dressing room a few minutes before 2. It was difficult to work out what had happened. There was no sign of a wound of any kind on her head or body, nor was she quite dead. She seemed to be in a coma of some kind. She had perhaps slipped and struck her head as she fell. Whatever the cause, he was out for the count. They were hours away from a final dress rehearsal, and Viola was in an ambulance being taken into intensive care. "The sooner they knock this place down, the better," said Hammersmith. He'd been drinking during office hours, something Calloway had never seen him do before. The whiskey bottle stood on his desk beside a half-full glass. There were glass marks ringing his accounts, and his hand had a bad dose of the shakes. "What's the news from the hospital?" "She's a beautiful woman," he said, staring at the glass. Calloway could have sworn he was on the verge of tears. "Hammersmith, how is she?" "She's in a coma, but her condition is stable." "That's something, I suppose." Hammersmith stared up at Calloway, his erupting brows knitted in anger. "You runt," he said. "You were screwing here, weren't you? Fancy yourself like that, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. Diane Duval is worth a dozen of you. A dozen." "Is that why you let this last production go on, Hammersmith? Because you'd seen her, and you wanted to get your hot little hands on her?" "You wouldn't understand. You've got your brain in your pants." He seemed genuinely offended by the interpretation Calloway had put on his admiration for Miss Duval. "All right, have it your way. We still have no Viola." "That's why I'm cancelling," said Hammersmith, slowing down to savour the moment. It had to come. Without Diane Duval there would be no 12th night. And maybe it was better that way. A knock on the door. "Who the fuck's that?" said Hammersmith softly. "Come." It was Litchfield. Calloway was almost glad to see that strange, scarred face. Though he had a lot of questions to ask of Litchfield about the state he'd left Diane in, about their conversation together. It wasn't an interview he was willing to conduct in front of Hammersmith. Besides, any half-formed accusations he might have had were countered by the man's presence here. If Litchfield had attempted violence on Diane for whatever reason, was it likely that he would come back so soon, so smilingly? "Who are you?" Hammersmith demanded. "Richard Walden Litchfield. I'm none the wiser. I used to be a trustee of the Elysium. Oh, I make it my business." "What do you want?" Hammersmith broke in, irritated by Litchfield's poise. "I hear the production is in jeopardy," Litchfield replied, unruffled. "No jeopardy," said Hammersmith, allowing himself a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "No jeopardy at all, because there's no show. It's been cancelled." "Oh?"
Hell yeah.
Litchfield looked at Calloway. "Is this with your consent?" he asked. "He has no say in the matter. I have sole right of cancellation if circumstances dictate it. It's in his contract. The theatre is closed as of today. It will not reopen." "Yes, it will," said Litchfield. "What?" Hammersmith stood up behind his desk, and Calloway realized he'd never seen the man standing before. He was very short. "We will play Twelfth Night, as advertised," Litchfield purred. "My wife has kindly agreed to understudy the part of Viola in place of Miss Duval." Hammersmith laughed, a coarse butcher's laugh. It died on his lips, however, as the office was suffused with lavender and Constantia Litchfield made her entrance, shimmering in silk and fur. She looked as perfect as the day she died. Even Hammersmith held his breath and his silence at the sight of her. "Our new Viola," Litchfield announced. After a moment, Hammersmith found his voice. "This woman can't step in at half a day's notice." "Why not?" said Calloway, not taking his eyes off the woman. Litchfield was a lucky man. Constantia was an extraordinary beauty. He scarcely dared draw breath in her presence for fear she'd vanish. Then she spoke. The lines were from Act 5, Scene 1. "If nothing lets to make us happy both, but this my masculine usurped attire, do not embrace me, till each circumstance of place, time, fortune do cohere and jump, that I am Viola." The voice was light and musical, but it seemed to resound in her body, filling each phrase with an undercurrent of suppressed passion. And that face, it was wonderfully alive, the features playing the story of her speech with delicate economy. She was enchanting. "I'm sorry," said Hammersmith, "but there are rules and regulations about this sort of thing. Is she equity?" "No," said Litchfield. "Well, you see, it's impossible. The union strictly precludes this kind of thing. They'd flay us alive." "What's it to you, Hammersmith?" said Calloway. "What the fuck do you care? You'll never need set foot in a theatre again once this place is demolished." "My wife has watched the rehearsals. She is word perfect." "It could be magic," said Calloway, his enthusiasm firing up with every moment he looked at Constantia. "You're risking the union, Calloway," Hammersmith chided. "I'll take that risk." "As you say, it's nothing to me. But if a little bird was to tell them, you'd have egg on your face." "Hammersmith, give her a chance. Give all of us a chance. If equity blacks me, that's my lookout." Hammersmith sat down again. "No, but you'll come, you know that, don't you? Diane Duval was a star. They would have sat through your turgid production to see her, Calloway. But an unknown. Well, it's your funeral. Go ahead and do it. I wash my hands of the whole thing. It's on your head, Calloway. Remember that. I hope they flay you for it." "Thank you," said Litchfield. "Most kind." Hammersmith began to rearrange his desk, to give more prominence to the bottle and the glass. The interview was over. He wasn't interested in these butterflies any longer. "Go away," he said. "Just go away." "I have one or two requests to make," Litchfield told Calloway as they left the office. alterations to the production which would enhance my wife's performance. What are they? For Constantia's comfort, I would ask that the lighting levels be taken down substantially. She is simply not accustomed to performing under such hot, bright lights. Very well. I'd also request that we install a row of footlights. Footlights? An odd requirement, I realize, but she feels much happier with footlights. They tend to dazzle the actors, said Calloway. It becomes difficult to see the audience. Nevertheless, I have to stipulate their installation. Okay. Thirdly, I would ask that all scenes involving kissing, embracing, or otherwise touching Constantia be redirected to remove every instance of physical contact whatsoever. Everything? Everything. For God's sake, why? My wife needs no business to dramatize the working of the heart, Terence. That curious intonation on the word heart. Working of the heart. Calloway caught Constantia's eye for the merest of moments. It was like being blessed. Shall we introduce our new viola to the company? Litchfield suggested. Why not? The trio went into the theatre. The rearranging of the blocking and the business to exclude any physical contact was simple, and though the rest of the cast were initially wary of their new colleague, her unaffected manner and her natural grace soon had them at her feet. Besides, her presence meant that the show would go on. At 6, Calloway called a break, announcing that they'd begin the dress at 8 and telling them to go out and enjoy themselves for an hour or so. The company went their ways, buzzing with a newfound enthusiasm for the production. What had looked like a shambles half a day earlier now seemed to be shaping up quite well. There were 1,000 things to be sniped at, of course. Technical shortcomings, costumes that fitted badly, directorial foibles, all par for the course. In fact, the actors were happier than they'd been in a good while. Even Ed Cunningham was not above passing a compliment or two. Litchfield found Tallulah in the green room, tidying. Good night. Yes, sir. You must not be afraid. I'm not afraid, Tallulah replied. What a thought. As if there may be some pain, which I regret, for you, indeed for all of us. I understand. Of course you do. You love the theatre as I love it. You know the paradox of this profession. To play life. Ah, Tallulah, to play life. What a curious thing it is. Sometimes I wonder, how long I can keep up the illusion. It's a wonderful performance, she said. Do you think so? Do you really think so? He was encouraged by her favorable review. It was so galling to have to pretend all the time, to fake the flesh, the breath, the look of life. Grateful for Tallulah's opinion, he reached for her. Would you like to die, Tallulah? Does it hurt? Scarcely at all. It would make me very happy. And so it should. His mouth covered her mouth, and she was dead in less than a minute, conceding happily to his inquiring tongue. He laid her out on the threadbare couch and locked the door of the green room with her own key. She'd cool easily in the chill of the room and be up and about again by the time the audience arrived. At 6:15, Diane Duval got out of a taxi at the front of the Elysium. It was well dark, a windy November night, but she felt fine. Nothing could depress tonight, not the dark, not the cold. Unseen, she made her way past the posters that bore her face and name, and through the empty auditorium to her dressing room. There, smoking his way through a pack of cigarettes, she found the object of her affection. Terry. She posed in the doorway for a moment, letting the fact of her reappearance sink in. He went quite white at the sight of her, so she pouted a little. It wasn't easy to pout. There was a stiffness in the muscles of her face, but she carried off the effect to her satisfaction. Calloway was lost for words. Diane looked ill, no two ways about it, and if she'd left the hospital to take up her part in the dress rehearsal, he was going to have to convince her otherwise. She was wearing no makeup, and her ash-blonde hair needed a wash. "What are you doing here?" he asked, as she closed the door behind her. "Unfinished business," she said. "Listen, I've got something to tell you." God, this was going to be messy. "We found a replacement in the show." She looked at him blankly. He hurried on, tripping over his own words. "Out of commission. I mean, not permanently, but, for the opening at least." "Don't worry," she said. His jaw dropped a little. "Don't worry? What's it to me?" "You said you came back to finish." He stopped. She was unbuttoning the top of her dress. She's not serious, he thought. She can't be serious. Sex? Now? "I've done a lot of thinking in the last few hours," she said as she shimmered the crumpled dress over her hips, let it fall, and stepped out of it. She was wearing a white bra, which she tried unsuccessfully to unhook. "I've decided I don't care about the theatre. Help me, will you?" She turned round and presented her back to him. Automatically, he unhooked the bra, not really analysing whether he wanted this or not. It seemed to be a fait accompli. She'd come back to finish what they'd been interrupted doing. Simple as that. And despite the bizarre noises she was making in the back of her throat, and the glassy look in her eyes, she was still an attractive woman. She turned again, and Calloway stared at the fullness of her breasts, paler than he'd remembered them, but lovely. His trousers were becoming uncomfortably tight, and her performance was only worsening his situation, the way she was grinding her hips like the rawest of Soho strippers, running her hands between her legs. "Don't worry about me," she said. "I've made up my mind. All I really want." She put her hands, so recently at her groin, on his face. They were icy cold. "All I really want is you. I can't have sex and the stage. There comes a time in everyone's life when decisions have to be made." She licked her lips. There was no film of moisture left on her mouth when her tongue had passed over it. "The accident made me think, made me analyse what it is I really care about. And frankly," she was unbuckling his belt, "I don't give a shit. Now there's it. About this, or any other fucking play." His trousers fell down. "I'll show you what I care about." She reached into his briefs and clasped him. Her cold hand somehow made the touch sexier. He laughed, closing his eyes as she pulled his briefs down to the middle of his thigh and knelt at his feet. She was as expert as ever, her throat open like a drain. Her mouth was somewhat drier than usual, her tongue scouring him, but the sensations drove him wild. It was so good he scarcely noticed the ease with which she devoured him, taking him deeper than she'd ever managed previously, using every trick she knew to goad him higher and higher, slow and deep, then picking up speed until he almost came, then slowing again until the need passed. He was completely at her mercy. He opened his eyes to watch her at work. She was skewering herself upon him, face in rapture. "God," he gasped, "that is so good! Oh, yes. Oh, yes." Her face didn't even flicker in response to his words. She just continued to work at him soundlessly. She wasn't making her usual noises, the small grunts of satisfaction, the heavy breathing through the nose. She just ate his flesh in absolute silence. He held his breath a moment, while an idea was born in his belly. The bobbing head bobbed on, eyes closed, lips clamped around his member, utterly engrossed. Half a minute passed. A minute and a half. And now his belly was full of terrors. She wasn't breathing. She was giving this matchless blowjob because she wasn't stopping, even for a moment, to inhale or exhale. Calloway felt his body go rigid, while his erection wilted in her throat. She didn't falter in her labor. The relentless pumping continued at his groin, even as his mind formed the unthinkable thought. She's dead. She has me in her mouth, in her cold mouth, and she's dead. That's why she'd come back, got up off her mortuary slab and come back. She was eager to finish what she'd started, no longer caring about the play or her usurper. It was this act she valued, this act alone. She'd chosen to perform it for eternity. Calloway could do nothing with the realization but stare down like a damn fool while his corpse gave him head. Then it seemed she sensed his horror. She opened her eyes and looked up at him. How could he ever have mistaken that dead stare for life? Gently, she withdrew his shrunken manhood from between her lips. "What is it?" she asked, her fluting voice still affecting life. You're not breathing." Her face fell. She let him go. "Oh, darling," she said, letting all pretense to life disappear. "I'm not so good at playing the part, am I?" Her voice was a ghost's voice, thin, forlorn. Her skin, which he had thought so flatteringly pale, was, on second view, a waxen white. "You are dead?" he said. "I'm afraid so. 2 hours ago in my sleep. I had to come, Terry. So much unfinished business. I made my choice. You should be flattered. You are flattered, aren't you?" She stood up and reached into her handbag, which she'd left beside the mirror. Calloway looked at the door, trying to make his limbs work, but they were inert. Besides, he had his trousers around his ankles. 2 steps and he'd fall flat on his face. She turned back on him with something silver and sharp in her hand. Try as he might, he couldn't get a focus on it. But whatever it was, she meant it for him. Since the building of the new crematorium in 1934, one humiliation had come after another for the cemetery. The tombs had been raided for lead coffin linings, the stones overturned and smashed. It was fouled by dogs and graffiti. Very few mourners now came to tend the graves. The generations had dwindled, and the small number of people who might still have had a loved one buried there were too infirm to risk the throttled walkways or too tender to bear looking at such vandalism. It had not always been so. There were illustrious and influential families interred behind the marble facades of the Victorian mausoleums. Founder fathers, local industrialists, and dignitaries, any and all who had done the town proud by their efforts. The body of the actress Constantia Litchfield had been buried here, until the day break and the shadows flee away, though her grave was almost unique in the attention some secret admirer still paid to it. Nobody was watching that night. It was too bitter for lovers. Nobody saw Charlotte Hancock open the door of her sepulchre with the beating wings of pigeons applauding her vigor as she shambled out to meet the moon. Her husband Gerard was with her, he less fresh than she, having been dead 13 years longer. Joseph Jardine, en famille, was not far behind the Hancocks, as was Marriott Fletcher, and Anne Snell, and the Peacock brothers. The list went on and on. In one corner, Alfred Crawshaw, captain in the 17th Lancers, was helping his lovely wife Emma from the rot of their bed. Everywhere faces pressed at the cracks of the tomb lids. Was that not Kezia Reynolds with her child, who'd lived just a day in her arms? And Martin van der Linde, the memory of the just is blessed, whose wife had never been found. Rosa and Selina Goldfinch, upstanding women both, and Thomas Jerry, and too many names to mention, too many states of decay to describe. Sufficient to say they rose, their burial finery fly-born, their faces stripped of all but the foundation of beauty. Still they came, swinging open the back gate of the cemetery and threading their way across the wasteland toward the Elysium. In the distance, the sound of traffic. Above, a jet roared in to land. One of the Peacock brothers, staring up at the winking giant as it passed over, missed his footing and fell on his face, shattering his jaw. They picked him up fondly and escorted him on his way. There was no harm done. And what would a resurrection be without a few laughs? So the show went on. If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. Calloway could not be found at Curtain, but Ryan had instructions from Hammersmith through the ubiquitous Mr. Litchfield to take the show up with or without the director. "He'll be upstairs, in the gods," said Litchfield. "In fact, I think I can see him from here." "Is he smiling?" asked Eddie. "Grinning from ear to ear. Then he is pissed." The actors laughed. There was a good deal of laughter that night. The show was running smoothly, and though they couldn't see the audience over the glare of the newly installed footlights, they could feel the waves of love and delight pouring out of the auditorium. The actors were coming off stage elated. "They're all sitting in the gods," said Eddie. "But your friends, Mr. Litchfield, do an old ham good. They're quiet, of course, with such big smiles on their faces." Act 1, Scene 2. And the first entrance of Constantia Litchfield as Viola was met with spontaneous applause. Such applause, like the hollow roll of snare drums, like the brittle beating of 1,000 sticks on 1,000 stretched skins. Lavish, wanton applause. And, my God, she rose to the occasion. She began the play as she meant to go on, giving her whole heart to the role, not needing physicality to communicate the depth of her feelings, but speaking the poetry with such intelligence and passion the merest flutter of her hand was worth more than 100 grander gestures. After that first scene, her every entrance was met with the same applause from the audience, followed by almost reverential silence. Backstage, a kind of buoyant confidence had set in. The whole company sniffed the success. A success which had been snatched miraculously from the jaws of disaster. There again. Applause. Applause. In his office, Hammersmith dimly registered the brittle din of adulation through a haze of booze. He was in the act of pouring his 8th drink when the door opened. He glanced up for a moment and registered that the visitor was that upstart Calloway. Come to gloat, I dare say, Hammersmith thought. Come to tell me how wrong I was. "What do you want?" The punk didn't answer. From the corner of his eye, Hammersmith had an impression of a broad, bright smile on Calloway's face. Self-satisfied half-wit, coming in here when a man was in mourning. "I suppose you've heard?" The other grunted. "She died," said Hammersmith, beginning to cry. "She died a few hours ago, without regaining consciousness. Haven't told the actors. Didn't seem worth it." Calloway said nothing in reply to this news. Didn't the bastard care? Couldn't he see that this was the end of the world? The woman was dead. She died in the bowels of the Elysium. There'd be official inquiries made. The insurance would be examined, a post-mortem, an inquest. It would reveal too much. He drank deeply from his glass, not bothering to look at Calloway again. "Your career'll take a dive after this, son. It won't just be me. Oh dear, no." Still, Calloway kept his silence. "Don't you care?" Hammersmith demanded. There was a silence for a moment. Then Calloway responded, "I don't give a shit. Jumped a little stage manager, that's all you are. That's all any of you fucking directors are. One good review and you're God's gift to art. Well, let me set you straight about that." He looked at Calloway, his eyes, swimming in alcohol, having difficulty focusing. But he got there eventually. Calloway, the dirty bugger, was naked from the waist down. He was wearing his shoes and his socks, but no trousers or briefs. His self-exposure would have been comical but for the expression on his face. The man had gone mad. His eyes were rolling around uncomfortably. Saliva and snot ran from mouth and nose. His tongue hung out like the tongue of a panting dog. Hammersmith put his glass down on his blotting pad and looked at the worst part. There was blood on Calloway's shirt, a trail of it which led up his neck to his left ear, from which protruded the end of Diane Duval's nail file. It had been driven deep into Calloway's brain. The man was surely dead. But he stood, spoke, walked. From the theatre there rose another round of applause, muted by distance. It wasn't a real sound, somehow. It came from another world, a place where emotions ruled. It was a world Hammersmith had always felt excluded from. He'd never been much of an actor, though God knows he'd tried. And the 2 plays he'd penned were, he knew, execrable. Bookkeeping was his forte, and he'd used it to stay as close to the stage as he could, hating his own lack of art as much as he resented that skill in others. The applause died, and as if taking a cue from an unseen prompter, Calloway came at him. The mask he wore was neither comic nor tragic. It was blood and laughter together. Cowering, Hammersmith was cornered behind his desk. Calloway leaped onto it. He looked so ridiculous, shirt tails and balls flip-flapping, and seized Hammersmith by the tie. "Philistine," said Calloway, never now to know Hammersmith's heart, and broke the man's neck. Snap, while below the applause began again. "Do not embrace me till each circumstance of place, time, fortune do cohere and jump, that I am Viola." From Constantia's mouth the lines were a revelation. It was almost as though this 12th night were a new play, and the part of Viola had been written for Constantia Litchfield alone. The actors who shared the stage with her felt their egos shriveling in the face of such a gift. The last act continued to its bittersweet conclusion. The audience as enthralled as ever, to judge by their breathless attention. The Duke spoke. "Give me thy hand, and bid me see thee in thy woman's weeds." In the rehearsal, the invitation in the line had been ignored. No one was to touch this Viola, much less take her hand. But in the heat of the performance, such taboos were forgotten. Possessed by the passion of the moment, the actor reached for Constantia. She, forgetting the taboo in her turn, reached to answer his touch. In the wings, Litchfield breathed "no" under his breath, but his order wasn't heard. The Duke grasped Viola's hand in his, life and death holding court together under this painted sky. It was a chilly hand, and without blood in its veins or a blush in its skin. But here it was as good as alive. They were equals, the living and the dead, and nobody could find just cause to part them. In the wings, Litchfield sighed and allowed himself a smile. He'd feared that touch, feared it would break the spell, but Dionysus was with them tonight. All would be well. He felt it in his bones. The act drew to a close, and Malvolio, still trumpeting his threats even in defeat, was carted off. One by one the company exited, leaving the clown to wrap up the play. "A great while ago the world began, with hey, ho, the wind and the rain. But that's all one. Our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day." The scene darkened to blackout, and the curtain descended. From the gods, rapturous applause erupted, that same rattling, hollow applause. The company, their faces shining with the success of the dress rehearsal, formed behind the curtain for the bow. The curtain rose. The applause mounted. In the wings, Calloway joined Litchfield. He was dressed now, and he'd washed the blood off his neck. "Well, we have a brilliant success," said the skull. "It does seem a pity that this company shall be dissolved so soon." "It does," said the corpse. The actors were shouting into the wings now, calling for Calloway to join them. They were applauding him, encouraging him to show his face. He put a hand on Litchfield's shoulder. "We'll go together, sir," he said. No, I couldn't." "You must. It's your triumph as much as mine." Litchfield nodded, and they went out together to take their bows beside the company. In the wings, Tallulah was at work. She felt restored after her sleep in the green room. So much unpleasantness had gone, taken with her life. She no longer suffered the aches in her hip or the creeping neuralgia in her scalp. There was no longer the necessity to draw breath through pipes encrusted with 70 years' muck, or to rub the backs of her hands to get the circulation going, not even the need to blink. She laid the fires with a new strength, pressing the detritus of past productions into use, old backdrops, props, costuming. When she had enough combustibles heaped, she struck a match and set the flame to them. The Elysium began to burn. Over the applause, somebody was shouting, "Marvellous, sweethearts! Marvellous!" It was Diane's voice. They all recognized it, even though they couldn't quite see her. She was staggering down the center aisle toward the stage, making quite a fool of herself. "Silly bitch," said Eddie. "Whoops," said Calloway. She was at the edge of the stage now, haranguing him. "Got all you wanted now, have you? This your new lady love, is it? Is it?" She was trying to clamber up, her hands gripping the hot metal hoods of the footlights. Her skin began to singe. The fat was well and truly in the fire. "For God's sake, somebody stop her," said Eddie. But she didn't seem to feel the searing of her hands. She just laughed in his face. The smell of burning flesh wafted up from the footlights. The company broke rank, triumph forgotten. Somebody yelled, "Kill the lights!" A beat, and then the stage lights were extinguished. Diane fell back, her hands smoking. One of the cast fainted. Another ran into the wings to be sick. Somewhere behind them they could hear the faint crackle of flames, but they had other calls on their attention. With the footlights gone, they could see the auditorium more clearly. The stalls were empty, but the balcony and the gods were full to bursting with eager admirers. Every row was packed, and every available inch of aisle space thronged with audience. Somebody up there started clapping again, alone for a few moments before the wave of applause began afresh. But now few of the company took pride in it. Even from the stage, even with exhausted and light-dazzled eyes, it was obvious that no man, woman, or child in that adoring crowd was alive. They waved fine silk handkerchiefs at the players in rotted fists. Some of them beat a tattoo on the seats in front of them. Most just clapped, bone on bone. Calloway smiled, bowed deeply, and received their admiration with gratitude. In all his 15 years of work in the theatre, he had never found an audience so appreciative. Bathing in the love of their admirers, Constantia and Richard Litchfield joined hands and walked downstage to take another bow. While the living actors retreated in horror. They began to yell and pray. They let out howls. They ran about like discovered adulterers in a farce. But, like the farce, there was no way out of the situation. There were bright flames tickling the roof joists, and billows of canvas cascaded down to right and left as the flies caught fire. In front, the dead. Behind, death. Smoke was beginning to thicken the air. It was impossible to see where one was going. Somebody was wearing a toga of burning canvas and reciting screams. Someone else was wielding a fire extinguisher against the inferno. All useless, all tired business badly managed. As the roof began to give, lethal falls of timber and girder silenced most. In the gods, the audience had more or less departed. They were ambling back to their graves long before the fire department appeared, their cerements and their faces lit by the glow of the fire as they glanced over their shoulders to watch the Elysium perish. It had been a fine show, and they were happy to go home, content for another while to gossip in the dark. The fire burned through the night, despite the never less than gallant efforts of the fire department to put it out. By 4 a.m, the fight was given up as lost, and the conflagration allowed its head. It had done with the Elysium by dawn. In the ruins, the remains of several persons were discovered, most of the bodies in states that defied easy identification. Dental records were consulted, and one corpse was found to be that of Giles Hammersmith, administrator, another that of Ryan Xavier, stage manager, and, most shockingly, a third that of Diane Duval. "Star of the love child burned to death," read the tabloids. She was forgotten in a week. There were no survivors. Several bodies were simply never found. They stood at the side of the motorway and watched the cars careering through the night. Litchfield was there, of course, and Constantia, radiant as ever. Calloway had chosen to go with them, so had Eddie and Tallulah. 3 or 4 others had also joined the troop. It was the first night of their freedom, and here they were on the open road, travelling players. The smoke alone had killed Eddie, but there were a few more serious injuries amongst their number sustained in the fire. Burned bodies, broken limbs. But the audience they would play for in the future would forgive them their petty mutilations. "There are lives lived for love," said Litchfield to his new company, "and lives lived for art. We, happy band, have chosen the latter persuasion." There was a ripple of applause amongst the actors. "To you who have never died, may I say, welcome to the world." Further applause. Cars racing north along the motorway threw the company into silhouette. They looked, to all intents and purposes, like living men and women. But then wasn't that the trick of their craft? To imitate life so well the illusion was indistinguishable from the real thing. And their new public, awaiting them in mortuaries, churchyards, and chapels of West, would appreciate that skill more than most. Who better to applaud the sham of passion and pain they would perform than the dead, who had experienced such feelings and thrown them off at last? The dead. They needed entertainment no less than the living, and they were a sorely neglected market. Not that this company would perform for money. They would play for the love of their art. Litchfield had made that clear from the outset. No more service would be done to Apollo. "Now," he said, "which road shall we take? North or south?" "North," said Eddie. "My mother's buried in Glasgow. She died before I ever played professionally. I'd like her to see me." "North it is, then," said Litchfield. "Shall we go and find ourselves some transport?" He led the way toward the motorway restaurant, its neon flickering fitfully, keeping the night at light's length. The colors were theatrically bright: scarlet, lime, cobalt, and a wash of white that splashed out of the windows onto the car park where they stood. The automatic doors hissed as a traveler emerged, bearing gifts of hamburgers and cake to the child in the back of his car. "Surely some friendly driver will find a niche for us," said Litchfield. "All of us?" said Calloway. "A truck will do. Beggars can't be too demanding," said Litchfield. "And we are beggars now, subject to the whim of our patrons." "We can always steal a car," said Tallulah. "No need for theft, except in extremity," Litchfield said. "Constantia and I will go ahead and find a chauffeur." He took his wife's hand. "Nobody refuses beauty," he said. "What do we do if anyone asks us what we're doing here?" asked Eddie nervously. He wasn't used to this role. He needed reassurance. Litchfield turned toward the company, his voice booming in the night. "What do you do?" he said. "Play life, of course, and smile."
In the Hills, the Cities, narrated by Chet Williamson.
It wasn't until the first week of the Yugoslavian trip that Mick discovered what a political bigot he'd chosen as a lover. Certainly, he'd been warned. One of the queens at the baths had told him Judd was to the right of Attila the Hun. But the man had been one of Judd's ex-affairs, and Mick had presumed there was more spite than perception in the character assassination. If only he'd listened. Then he wouldn't be driving along an interminable road in a Volkswagen that suddenly seemed the size of a coffin, listening to Judd's views on Soviet expansionism. Jesus, he was so boring. He didn't converse, he lectured, and endlessly. In Italy, the sermon had been on the way the communists had exploited the peasant vote. Now, in Yugoslavia, Judd had really warmed to this theme, and Mick was just about ready to take a hammer to his self-opinionated head. It wasn't that he disagreed with everything Judd said. Some of the arguments, the ones Mick understood, seemed quite sensible. But then, what did he know? He was a dance teacher. Judd was a journalist, a professional pundit. He felt, like most journalists Mick had encountered, that he was obliged to have an opinion on everything under the sun, especially politics. That was the best trough to wallow in. You could get your snout, eyes, head, and front hooves in that mess of muck and have a fine old time splashing around. It was an inexhaustible subject to devour, a swill with a little of everything in it, because everything, according to Judd, was political. The arts were political, sex was political, religion, commerce, gardening, eating, drinking, and farting, all political. Jesus, it was mind-blowingly boring, killingly, love-deadeningly boring. Worse still, Judd didn't seem to notice how bored Mick had become, or if he noticed, he didn't care. He just rambled on, his arguments getting windier and windier, his sentences lengthening with every mile they drove. Judd, Mick had decided, was a selfish bastard, and as soon as their honeymoon was over, he'd part with the guy. It was not until their trip, that endless, motiveless caravan through the graveyards of mid-European culture, that Judd realized what a political lightweight he had in Mick. The guy showed precious little interest in the economics or the politics of the countries they passed through. He registered indifference to the full facts behind the Italian situation and yawned, yes, yawned, when he tried and failed to debate the Russian threat to world peace. He had to face the bitter truth. Mick was a queen. There was no other word for him. All right, perhaps he didn't mince or wear jewelry to excess, but he was a queen nevertheless, happy to wallow in a dream world of early Renaissance frescoes and Yugoslavian icons. The complexities, the contradictions, even the agonies that made those cultures blossom and wither were just tiresome to him. His mind was no deeper than his looks. He was a well-groomed nobody. Some honeymoon. The road south from Belgrade to Novi Pazar was, by Yugoslavian standards, a good one. There were fewer potholes than on many of the roads they traveled, and it was relatively straight. The town of Novi Pazar lay in the valley of the river Raska, south of the city named after the river. It wasn't an area particularly popular with the tourists. Despite the good road, it was still inaccessible and lacked sophisticated amenities. But Mick was determined to see the monastery at Sobocani, to the west of the town, and after some bitter argument, he'd won. The journey had proved uninspiring. On either side of the road, the cultivated fields looked parched and dusty. The summer had been unusually hot, and droughts were affecting many of the villages. Crops had failed, and livestock had been prematurely slaughtered to prevent them dying of malnutrition. There was a defeated look about the few faces they glimpsed at the roadside. Even the children had dour expressions, brows as heavy as the stale heat that hung over the valley. Now, with the cards on the table after a row at Belgrade, they drove in silence most of the time. But the straight road, like most straight roads, invited dispute. When the driving was easy, the mind rooted for something to keep it engaged. What better than a fight? Why the hell do you want to see this damn monastery? Judd demanded. It was an unmistakable invitation. We've come all this way. Mick tried to keep the tone conversational. He wasn't in the mood for an argument. More fucking virgins, is it? Keeping his voice as even as he could, Mick picked up the guide and read aloud from it. There, some of the greatest works of Serbian painting can still be seen and enjoyed, including what many commentators agree to be the enduring masterpiece of the Raska school, the Dormition of the Virgin. Silence. Then Judd. I'm up to here with churches. It's a masterpiece. They're all masterpieces according to that bloody book. Mick felt his control slipping. 2.5 hours at most. I told you, I don't want to see another church. The smell of the places makes me sick. Stale incense, old sweat and lies. It's a short detour. Then we can get back onto the road, and you can give me another lecture on farming subsidies in the Sanzak. I'm just trying to get some decent conversation going, instead of this endless tripe about Serbian fucking masterpieces. Stop the car. What? Stop the car. Judd pulled the Volkswagen into the side of the road. Mick got out. The road was hot, but there was a slight breeze. He took a deep breath and wandered into the middle of the road, empty of traffic and of pedestrians in both directions. In every direction, empty. The hills shimmered in the heat off the fields. There were wild poppies growing in the ditches. Mick crossed the road, squatted on his haunches, and picked one. Behind him, he heard the VW's door slam. "What did you stop us for?" Judd said. His voice was edgy, still hoping for that argument, begging for it. Mick stood up, playing with the poppy. It was close to seeding, late in the season. The petals fell from the receptacle as soon as he touched them, little splashes of red fluttering down onto the gray tarmac. "I asked you a question," Judd said again. Mick looked around. Judd was standing the far side of the car, his brows a knitted line of burgeoning anger. But handsome. Oh yes, a face that made women weep with frustration that he was gay. A heavy black mustache, perfectly trimmed, and eyes you could watch forever and never see the same light in them twice. Why, in God's name, thought Mick, does a man as fine as that have to be such an insensitive little shit? Judd returned the look of contemptuous appraisal, staring at the pouting pretty boy across the road. It made him want to puke, seeing the little act Mick was performing for his benefit. It might just have been plausible in a 16-year-old virgin. In a 25-year-old, it lacked credibility. Mick dropped the flower and untucked his T-shirt and his jeans. A tight stomach, then a slim, smooth chest were revealed as he pulled it off. His hair was ruffled when his head reappeared, and his face wore a broad grin. Judd looked at the torso, neat, not too muscular, an appendix scar peering over his faded jeans. A gold chain, small but catching the sun, dipped in the hollow of his throat. Without meaning to, he returned Mick's grin, and a kind of peace was made between them. Mick was unbuckling his belt. "Want to fuck?" he said, the grin not faltering. "It's no use," came in answer, though not to that question. "What isn't?" "We're not compatible." "Want a bet?" Now he was unzipped and turning away toward the wheat field that bordered the road. Judd watched as Mick cut a swath through the swaying sea, his back the color of the grain, so that he was almost camouflaged by it. It was a dangerous game, screwing in the open air. This wasn't San Francisco or even Hampstead Heath. Nervously, Judd glanced along the road, still empty in both directions, and Mick was turning deep in the field, turning and smiling and waving like a swimmer buoyed up in a golden surf. What the hell? There was nobody to see, nobody to know. Just the hills, liquid in the heat haze, their forested backs bent to the business of the earth, and a lost dog sitting at the edge of the road, waiting for some lost master. Judd followed Mick's path through the wheat, unbuttoning his shirt as he walked. Field mice ran ahead of him, scurrying through the stalks as the giant came their way, his feet like thunder. Judd saw their panic and smiled. He meant no harm to them, but then how were they to know that? Maybe he'd put out 100 lives, mice, beetles, worms, before he reached the spot where Mick was lying, stark, bollock naked, on a bed of trampled grain, still grinning. It was good love they made, good, strong love, equal in pleasure for both. There was a precision to their passion, sensing the moment when effortless delight became urgent, when desire became necessity. They locked together, limb around limb, tongue around tongue, in a knot only orgasm could untie. Their backs alternately scorched and scratched as they rolled around, exchanging blows and kisses. In the thick of it, creaming together, they heard the thut-thut-thut of a tractor passing by, but they were past caring. They made their way back to the Volkswagen with body-threshed wheat in their hair and their ears, in their socks and between their toes. Their grins had been replaced with easy smiles. The truce, if not permanent, would last a couple of hours at least. The car was baking hot, and they had to open all the windows and doors to let the breeze cool it before they started toward Novi Pazar. It was 4 o'clock, and there was still an hour's driving ahead. As they got into the car, Mick said, "We'll forget the monastery, eh?" Judd gaped. I thought, I couldn't bear another fucking virgin. They laughed lightly together, then kissed, tasting each other and themselves, a mingling of saliva and the aftertaste of salt semen. The following day was bright, but not particularly warm. No blue skies, cloud. The morning air was sharp and or peppermint. Václav yellowed the pigeons in the main square of Gopalok, courting death as they skipped and fluttered ahead of the vehicles that were buzzing around. Some about military business, some civilian. An air of sober intention barely expressed the excitement he felt on this day. An excitement he knew was shared by every man, woman, and child in Gopalok. Shared by the pigeons, too, for all he knew. Maybe that was why they played under the wheels with such dexterity, knowing that on this day of days no harm could come to them. He scanned the sky again, that same white sky he'd been peering at dawn. The cloud layer was low, not ideal for the celebrations. A phrase passed through his mind, an English phrase he had heard from a friend, to have your head in the clouds. It meant, he gathered, to be lost in a reverie, in a white, sightless dream. That, he thought wryly, was all the West knew about the clouds, that they stood for dreams. It took a vision they lacked to make a truth out of that casual turn of phrase. Here in these secret hills, wouldn't they create a spectacular reality from those idle words? A living proverb, a head in the clouds. Already the first contingent was assembling in the square. There were 1 or 2 absentees owing to illness, but the auxiliaries were ready and waiting to take their places. Such eagerness, such wide smiles when an auxiliary heard his or her name and number called and was taken out of line to join the limb that was already taking shape. On every side, miracles of organization, everyone with a job to do and a place to go. There was no shouting or pushing. Indeed, voices were scarcely raised above an eager whisper. He watched in admiration as the work of positioning and buckling and roping went on. It was going to be a long and arduous day. Václav had been in the square since an hour before dawn, drinking coffee from imported plastic cups, discussing the half-hourly meteorological reports coming in from Pristina and Mitrovica, and watching the starless sky as the gray light of morning crept across it. Now he was drinking his 6th coffee of the day, and it was still barely 7 o'clock. Across the square, Metzinger looked as tired and as anxious as Václav felt. They'd watched the dawn seep out of the east together, Metzinger and he. But now they had separated, forgetting previous companionship, and would not speak until the contest was over. After all, Metzinger was from Podujevo. He had his own city to support in the coming battle. Tomorrow they'd exchange tales of their adventures, but for today they must behave as if they didn't know each other, not even to exchange a smile. For today they had to be utterly partisan, caring only for the victory of their own city over the opposition. Now the first leg of Gopalok was erected, to the mutual satisfaction of Metzinger and Václav. All the safety checks had been meticulously made, and the leg left the square, its shadow falling hugely across the face of the town hall. Václav sipped his sweet, sweet coffee and allowed himself a little grunt of satisfaction. Such days, days filled with glory, with snapping flags and high, stomach-turning sights, enough to last a man a lifetime. It was a golden foretaste of heaven. Let America have its simple pleasures, its cartoon mice, its candy-coated castles, its cults and its technologies. He wanted none of it. The greatest wonder of the world was here, hidden in the hills. Ah, such days. In the main square of Podujevo, the scene was no less animated and no less inspiring. Perhaps there was a muted sense of sadness underlying this year's celebration, but that was understandable. Nita Obrenović, Podujevo's loved and respected organizer, was no longer living. The previous winter had claimed her at the age of 94, leaving the city bereft of her fierce opinions and her fiercer proportions. For 60 years, Nita had worked with the citizens of Podujevo, always planning for the next contest and improving on the designs. Her energy spent on making the next creation more ambitious and more lifelike than the last. Now she was dead and sorely missed. There was no disorganization in the streets without her. The people were far too disciplined for that. But they were already falling behind schedule, and it was almost 7:25. Nita's daughter had taken over in her mother's stead, but she lacked Nita's power to galvanize the people into action. She was, in a word, too gentle for the job in hand. It required a leader who was part prophet and part ringmaster, to coax and bully and inspire the citizens into their places. Maybe, after 2 or 3 decades, and with a few more contests under her belt, Nita Obrenović's daughter would make the grade. But for today, Podujevo was behindhand. Safety checks were being overlooked. Nervous looks replaced the confidence of earlier years. Nevertheless, at 6 minutes before 8, the first limb of Podujevo made its way out of the city to the assembly point to wait for its fellow. By that time, the flanks were already lashed together in Popolok, and armed contingents were awaiting orders in the town square. Mick woke promptly at 7, though there was no alarm clock in their simply furnished room at the Hotel Beograd. He lay in his bed and listened to Judd's regular breathing from the twin bed across the room. A dull morning light whimpered through the thin curtains, not encouraging an early departure. After a few minutes staring at the cracked paintwork on the ceiling, and a while longer at the crudely carved crucifix on the opposite wall, Mick got up and went to the window. It was a dull day, as he had guessed. The sky was overcast, and the roofs of Novi Pazar were gray and featureless in the flat morning light. But beyond the roofs, to the east, he could see the hills. There was sun there. He could see shafts of light catching the blue-green of the forest, inviting a visit to their slopes. Today, maybe they would go south to Kozovka, Mitrovica. There was a market there, wasn't there? And a museum? And they could drive down the valley of the Ibar, following the road beside the river, where the hills rose wild and shining on either side. The hills, yes. Today, he decided they would see the hills. It was 8:15. By 9, the main bodies of Popolok and Podujevo were substantially assembled. In their allotted districts, the limbs of both cities were ready and waiting to join their expectant torsos. Václav Yelosek capped his gloved hands over his eyes and surveyed the sky. The cloud base had risen in the last hour, no doubt of it, and there were breaks in the clouds to the west, even on occasion, a few glimpses of the sun. It wouldn't be a perfect day for the contest, perhaps, but certainly adequate. Mick and Judd breakfasted late on hemendik, roughly translated as ham and eggs, and several cups of good black coffee. It was brightening now, even in Novi Pazar, and their ambitions were set high. Kozovka Mitrovica by lunchtime, and maybe a visit to the hill castle of Jvechon in the afternoon. About 9:30, they motored out of Novi Pazar and took the Srbovac road south to the Ibar Valley. Not a good road, but the bumps and potholes couldn't spoil the new day. The road was empty except for the occasional pedestrian, and in place of the maize and cornfields they'd passed on the previous day, the road was flanked by undulating hills, whose sides were thickly and darkly forested. Apart from a few birds, they saw no wildlife. Even their infrequent traveling companions petered out altogether after a few miles, and the occasional farmhouse they drove by appeared locked and shuttered up. Black pigs ran unattended in the yard, with no child to feed them. Washing snapped and billowed on the sagging line, with no washerwoman in sight. At first, this solitary journey through the hills was refreshing in its lack of human contact, but as the morning drew on, an uneasiness grew on them. Shouldn't we have seen a signpost to Mitrovica? He peered at the map. Maybe we've taken the wrong road. If there'd been a sign, I'd have seen it. I think we should try and get off this road. Bear south a bit more. Meet the valley closer to Mitrovica than we'd planned. How do we get off this bloody road? There've been a couple of turnings. Dirt tracks. Well, it's either that or going on the way we are. Judd pursed his lips. Cigarette, he asked. Finished them miles back. In front of them, the hills formed an impenetrable line.
Cheers.
There was no sign of life ahead, no frail wisp of chimney smoke, no sound of voice or vehicle. All right, said Judd. We take the next turning. Anything's better than this. They drove on. The road was deteriorating rapidly, the potholes becoming craters, the hummocks feeling like bodies beneath the wheels. Then, there, a turning, a palpable turning, not a major road, certainly. In fact, barely the dirt track Judd had described the other roads as being, but it was an escape from the endless perspective of the road they were trapped on. This is becoming a bloody safari, said Judd, as the VW began to bump and grind its way along the doleful little track. Where's your sense of adventure? I forgot to pack it. They were beginning to climb now, as the track wound its way up into the hills. The forest closed over them, blotting out the sky, so a shifting patchwork of light and shadow scooted over the bonnet as they drove. There was birdsong suddenly, vacuous and optimistic, and a smell of new pine and undug earth. A fox crossed the track up ahead and watched a long moment as the car grumbled up toward it. Then, with the leisurely stride of a fearless prince, it sauntered away into the trees. Wherever they were going, Mick thought, this was better than the road they'd left. Soon maybe they'd stop and walk a while, to find a promontory from which they could see the valley, even Novi Pazar nestled behind them. The two men were still an hour's drive from Popolok when the head of the contingent at last marched out of the town square and took up its position with the main body. This last exit left the city completely deserted. Not even the sick or the old were neglected on this day. No one was to be denied the spectacle and the triumph of the contest. Every single citizen, however young or infirm, the blind, the crippled, babes in arms, pregnant women, all made their way up from their proud city to the stamping ground. It was the law that they should attend, but it needed no enforcing. No citizen of either city would have missed the chance to see that sight, to experience the thrill of that contest. The confrontation had to be total, city against city. This was the way it had always been. So the cities went up into the hills. By noon they were gathered, the citizens of Popolok and Podujevo, in the secret well of the hills, hidden from civilized eyes to do ancient and ceremonial battle. Tens of thousands of hearts beat faster. Tens of thousands of bodies stretched and strained and sweated as the twin cities took their positions. The shadows of the bodies darkened tracts of land the size of small towns. The weight of their feet trampled the grass to a green milk. Their movement killed animals, crushed bushes and threw down trees. The earth literally reverberated with their passage, the hills echoing with the booming din of their steps. In the towering body of Podujevo, a few technical hitches were becoming apparent. A slight flaw in the knitting of the left flank had resulted in a weakness there, and there were consequent problems in the swiveling mechanism of the hips. It was stiffer than it should be, and the movements were not smooth. As a result, there was considerable strain being put upon that region of the city. It was being dealt with bravely. After all, the contest was intended to press the contestants to their limits. But breaking point was closer than anyone would have dared to admit. The citizens were not as resilient as they had been in previous contests. A bad decade for crops had produced bodies less well-nourished, spines less supple, wills less resolute. The badly knitted flank might not have caused an accident in itself, but further weakened by the frailty of the competitors, it set a scene for death on an unprecedented scale. They stopped the car. Hear that? Mick shook his head. His hearing hadn't been good since he was an adolescent. Too many rock shows had blown his eardrums to hell. Judd got out of the car. The birds were quieter now. The noise he'd heard as they drove came again. It wasn't simply a noise. It was almost emotion in the earth, a roar that seemed seated in the substance of the hills. Thunder, was it? No, too rhythmical. It came again, through the soles of the feet. Boom. Mick heard it this time. He leaned out of the car window. It's up ahead somewhere. I hear it now. Judd nodded. Boom. The earth thunder sounded again. What the hell is it? Said Mick. Whatever it is, I want to see it. Judd got back into the Volkswagen, smiling. Sounds almost like guns, he said, starting the car. Big guns. Through his Russian-made binoculars, Vaslav Yelosek watched the starting official raise his pistol. He saw the feather of white smoke rise from the barrel, and a second later heard the sound of the shot across the valley. The contest had begun. He looked up at twin towers of Popolok and Podujevo, heads in the clouds. Well, almost. They practically stretched to touch the sky. It was an awesome sight, a breath-stopping, sleep-stabbing sight. Two cities swaying and writhing and preparing to take their first steps toward each other in this ritual battle. Of the two, Podujevo seemed the less stable. There was a slight hesitation as the city raised its left leg to begin its march. Nothing serious, just a little difficulty in coordinating hip and thigh muscles. A couple of steps, and the city would find its rhythm. A couple more, and its inhabitants would be moving as one creature, one perfect giant set to match its grace and power against its mirror image. The gunshot had sent flurries of birds up from the trees that banked the hidden valley. They rose up in celebration of the great contest, chattering their excitement as they swooped over the stamping ground. Did you hear a shot? Asked Judd. Mick nodded. Military exercises? Judd's smile had broadened. He could see the headlines already. Exclusive reports of secret maneuvers in the depths of the Yugoslavian countryside. Russian tanks, perhaps. Tactical exercises being held out of the West's prying sight. With luck, he would be the carrier of this news. Boom. Boom. There were birds in the air. The thunder was louder now. It did sound like guns. It's over the next ridge, said Judd. I don't think we should go any further. I have to see. I don't. We're not supposed to be here. I don't see any signs. They'll cart us away, deport us. I don't know. I just think... Oh, I've got to see. The words were scarcely out of his mouth when the screaming started. Podujevo was screaming, a death cry. Someone buried in the weak flank had died of the strain and had begun a chain of decay in the system. One man loosed his neighbor, and that neighbor loosed his, spreading a cancer of chaos through the body of the city. The coherence of the towering structure deteriorated with terrifying rapidity as the failure of one part of the anatomy put unendurable pressure on the other. The masterpiece that the good citizens of Podujevo had constructed of their own flesh and blood tottered, and then, a dynamited skyscraper, it began to fall. The broken flank spewed citizens like a slashed artery spitting blood. Then, with a graceful sloth that made the agonies of the citizens all the more horrible, it bowed toward the earth, all its limbs dissembling as it fell. The huge head that had brushed the clouds so recently was flung back on its thick neck. 10,000 mouths spoke a single scream for its vast mouth, a wordless, infinitely pitiable appeal to the sky. A howl of loss, a howl of anticipation, a howl of puzzlement. How, that scream demanded, could the day of days end like this in a welter of falling bodies? Did you hear that? It was unmistakably human, though almost deafeningly loud. Judd's stomach convulsed. He looked across at Mick, who was as white as a sheet. Judd stopped the car. "No," said Mick. "Listen, for Christ's sake." The din of dying moans, appeals, and imprecations flooded the air. It was very close. "We've got to go on now," Mick implored. Judd shook his head. He was prepared for some military spectacle, all the Russian army massed over the next hill. But that noise in his ears was the noise of human flesh, too human for words. It reminded him of his childhood imaginings of hell, the endless, unspeakable torments his mother had threatened him with if he failed to embrace Christ. It was a terror he'd forgotten for 20 years, but suddenly, here it was again, fresh-faced. Maybe the pit itself gave just over the next horizon, with his mother standing at its lip, inviting him to taste its punishments. "If you won't drive, I will." Mick got out of the car and crossed in front of it, glancing up the track as he did so. There was a moment's hesitation, no more than a moment's, when his eyes flickered with disbelief. Before he turned toward the windscreen, his face even paler than it had been previously, and said, "Jesus Christ," in a voice that was thick with suppressed nausea. His lover was still sitting behind the wheel, his head in his hands, trying to blot out memories. "Judd." Judd looked up, slowly. Mick was staring at him like a wild man, his face shining with a sudden icy sweat. Judd looked past him. A few meters ahead, the track had mysteriously darkened as a tide edged toward the car, a thick, deep tide of blood. Judd's reason twisted and turned to make any other sense of the sight than that inevitable conclusion. But there was no saner explanation. It was blood, in unendurable abundance, blood without end. And now in the breeze there was the flavor of freshly opened carcasses, the smell out of the depths of the human body, part sweet, part savory. Mick stumbled back to the passenger side of the VW and fumbled weakly at the handle. The door opened suddenly, and he lurched inside, his eyes glazed. "Pack up," he said. Judd reached for the ignition. The tide of blood was already sloshing against the front wheels. Ahead, the world had been painted red. "Drive, for fuck's sake, drive!" Judd was making no attempt to start the car. "We must look," he said, without conviction. "We have to." "We don't have to do anything," said Mick, "but get the hell out of here. It's not our business." Plane crash. "There's no smoke." Those are human voices. Mick's instinct was to leave well alone. He could read about the tragedy in a newspaper. He could see the pictures tomorrow when they were gray and grainy. Today it was too fresh, too unpredictable. Anything could be at the end of that track, bleeding. "We must." Judd started the car, while beside him Mick began to moan quietly. The VW began to edge forward, nosing through the river of blood, its wheels spinning in the queasy, foaming tide.
No,
Said Mick very quietly.
please, no.
We must, was Judd's reply. We must. We must. Only a few yards away, the surviving city of Popelok was recovering from its first convulsions. It stared with 1,000 eyes at the ruins of its ritual enemy, now spread in a tangle of rope and bodies over the impacted ground, shattered forever. Popelok staggered back from the sight, its vast legs flattening the forest that bounded the stamping ground, its arms flailing the air. But it kept its balance, even as a common insanity, woken by the horror at its feet, surged through its sinews and curdled its brain. The order went out. The body thrashed and twisted and turned from the grisly carpet of Poduyevo and fled into the hills. As it headed into oblivion, its towering form passed between the car and the sun, throwing its cold shadow over the bloody road. Mick saw nothing through his tears, and Judd, his eyes narrowed against the sight he feared seeing around the next bend, only dimly registered that something had blotted the light for a minute. A cloud, perhaps, a flock of birds. Had he looked up at that moment, just stolen a glance out toward the northeast, he would have seen Popelok's head, the vast swarming head of a maddened city, disappearing below his line of vision as it marched into the hills. He would have known that this territory was beyond his comprehension, and that there was no healing to be done in this corner of hell. But he didn't see the city, and he and Mick's last turning point had passed. From now on, like Popelok and its dead twin, they were lost to sanity and to all hope of life. They rounded the bend, and the ruins of Poduyevo came into sight. Their domesticated imaginations had never conceived of a sight so unspeakably brutal. Perhaps in the battlefields of Europe as many corpses had been heaped together, but had so many of them been women and children locked together with the corpses of men? There had been piles of dead as high, but ever so many so recently abundant with life? There had been cities laid waste as quickly, but ever an entire city lost to the simple dictate of gravity? It was a sight beyond sickness. In the face of it, the mind slowed to a snail's pace. The forces of reason picked over the evidence with meticulous hands, searching for a flaw in it, a place where it could say, "This is not happening. This is a dream of death, not death itself." But reason could find no weakness in the wall. This was true. It was death, indeed. Poduyevo had fallen. 38,765 citizens were spread on the ground, or rather flung in ungainly, seeping piles. Those who had not died of the fall or of suffocation were dying. There would be no survivors from that city, except that bundle of onlookers that had traipsed out of their homes to watch the contest. Those few Poduyevians, the crippled, the sick, the ancient few, were now staring like Mick and Judd at the carnage, trying not to believe. Judd was first out of the car. The ground beneath his swathes was sticky with coagulating gore. He surveyed the carnage. There was no wreckage, no sign of a plane crash, no fire, no smell of fuel, just tens of thousands of fresh bodies, all either naked or dressed in an identical gray serge, men, women, and children alike. Some of them, he could see, wore leather harnesses tightly buckled around their upper chests, and snaking out from these contraptions were lengths of rope, miles and miles. The closer he looked, the more he saw the extraordinary system of knots and lashings that still held the bodies together. For some reason, these people had been tied together, side by side. Some were yoked on their neighbors' shoulders, saddling them like boys playing at horseback riding. Others were locked arm in arm, knitted together with threads of rope in a wall of muscle and bone. Yet others were trussed in a ball, with
Yeah,
their
definitely
heads
a good
tucked
one.
between their knees. All were in some way connected up with their fellows, tied together as though in some insane collective bondage game. Another shot. Mick looked up. Across the field, a solitary man dressed in a drab overcoat was walking amongst the bodies with a revolver, dispatching the dying. It was a pitifully inadequate act of mercy, but he went on nevertheless, choosing the suffering children first, emptying the revolver, lifting it again, emptying it, filling it, emptying it. Mick let go. He yelled at the top of his voice over the moans of the injured, "What is this?" The man looked up from his appalling duty, his face as dead gray as his coat. "Huh," he grunted, frowning at the two interlopers through his thick spectacles. "What's happened here?" Mick shouted across at him. It felt good to shout. It felt good to sound angry at the man. Maybe he was to blame. It would be a fine thing just to have someone to blame. "Tell us," Mick said. He could hear the tears throbbing in his voice. "Tell us, for God's sake. Explain." Greycoat shook his head. He didn't understand a word this young idiot was saying. It was English he spoke, but that's all he knew. Mick began to walk toward him, feeling all the time the eyes of the dead on him. Eyes like black shining gems set in broken faces. Eyes looking at him upside down on heads severed from their seating. Eyes in heads that had solid howls for voices. Eyes in heads beyond howls, beyond breath. Thousands of eyes. He reached Greycoat, whose gun was almost empty. He had taken off his spectacles and thrown them aside. He too was weeping. Little jerks ran through his big, ungainly body. At Mick's feet, somebody was reaching for him. He didn't want to look, but the hand touched his shoe, and he had no choice but to see its owner. A young man, lying like a flesh swastika, every joint smashed. A child lay under him, her bloody legs poking out like two pink sticks. He wanted the man's revolver, to stop the hand from touching him. Better still, he wanted a machine gun, a flamethrower, anything to wipe the agony away. As he looked up from the broken body, Mick saw Greycoat raise the revolver. "Judd," he said, but as the word left his lips, the muzzle of the revolver was slipped into Greycoat's mouth and the trigger was pulled. Greycoat had saved the last bullet for himself. The back of his head opened like a dropped egg, the shell of his skull flying off. His body went limp and sank to the ground, the revolver still between his lips. "We must," began Mick, saying the words to nobody. "We must." What was the imperative? In this situation, what must they do? "We must." Judd was behind him. "Help," he said to Mick. "Yes, we must get help. We must go." Go. That was what they must do. On any pretext, for any fragile, cowardly reason, they must go. Get out of the battlefield, get out of the reach of a dying hand with a wound in place of a body. "We have to tell the authorities. Find a town. Get help." "Priests," said Mick. "They need priests." It was absurd to think of giving the last rites to so many people. It would take an army of priests, a water cannon filled with holy water, a loudspeaker to pronounce the benedictions. They turned away together from the horror and wrapped their arms around each other, then picked their way through the carnage to the car. It was occupied. Václav Yelovsek was sitting behind the wheel and trying to start the Volkswagen. He turned the ignition key once, twice. Third time the engine cocked and the wheels spun in the crimson mud as he put her into reverse and backed down the track. Václav saw the Englishman running toward the car, cursing him. There was no help for it. He didn't want to steal the vehicle, but he had work to do. He had been a referee. He had been responsible for the contest and the safety of the contestants. One of the heroic cities had already fallen. He must do everything in his power to prevent Popelak from following its twin. He must chase Popelak and reason with it, talk it down out of its terrors with quiet words and promises. If he failed, there would be another disaster, the equal of the one in front of him, and his conscience was already broken enough. Mick was still chasing the VW, shouting at Yelovsek. The thief took no notice, concentrating on maneuvering the car back down the narrow, slippery track. Mick was losing the chase rapidly. The car had begun to pick up speed. Furious, but without the breath to speak his fury, Mick stood in the road, hands on his knees, heaving and sobbing. "Bastard," said Judd. Mick looked down the track. Their car had already disappeared. "Fucker couldn't even drive properly." We have to catch her up," said Mick through gulps of breath. "How?" "On foot. We haven't even got a map. It's in the car." "Jesus Christ Almighty." They walked down the track together, away from the field. After a few meters, the tide of blood began to peter out. Just a few congealing rivulets dribbled on toward the main road. Mick and Judd followed the bloody tire marks to the junction. The Srbovac road was empty in both directions. The tire marks showed a left turn. "He's gone deeper into the hills," said Judd, staring along the lovely road toward the blue-green distance. "He's out of his mind." "Do we go back the way we came?" "It'll take us all night on foot." "We'll hop a lift." Judd shook his head. His face was slack and his look lost. "Don't you see, Mick? They all knew this was happening. The people in the farms, they got the hell out while those people went crazy up there. There'll be no cars along this road, I'll lay you anything. Except maybe a couple of shit-dumb tourists like us. And no tourist would stop for the likes of us." He was right. They looked like butchers, splattered with blood. Their faces were shining with grease, their eyes maddened. "We'll have to walk," said Judd, the way he went. He pointed along the road. The hills were darker now. The sun had suddenly gone out on their slopes. Mick shrugged. Either way, he could see they had a night on the road ahead of them. But he wanted to walk somewhere, anywhere, as long as he put distance between him and the dead. In Popelak, a kind of peace reigned. Instead of a frenzy of panic, there was a numbness, a sheep-like acceptance of the world as it was. Locked in their positions, strapped, roped and harnessed to each other in a living system that allowed for no single voice to be louder than any other, nor any back to labor less than its neighbors. They let an insane consensus replace the tranquil voice of reason. They were convulsed into one mind, one thought, one ambition. They became, in the space of a few moments, the single-minded giant whose image they had so brilliantly recreated. The illusion of petty individuality was swept away in an irresistible tide of collective feeling, not a mob's passion, but a telepathic surge that dissolved the voices of thousands into one irresistible command. And the voice said, "Go." The voice said, "Take this horrible sight away, where I need never see it again." Popelak turned away into the hills, its legs taking strides half a mile long. Each man, woman, and child in that seething tower was sightless. They saw only through the eyes of the city. They were thoughtless, but to think the city's thoughts. And they believed themselves deathless in their lumbering, relentless strength, vast and mad and deathless. 2 miles along the road, Mick and Judd smelled petrol in the air, and a little further along they came upon the VW. It had overturned in the reed-clogged drainage ditch at the side of the road. It had not caught fire. The driver's door was open, and the body of Vaslav Yelovsek had tumbled out. His face was calm in unconsciousness. There seemed to be no sign of injury, except for a small cut or two on his sober face. They gently pulled the thief out of the wreckage and up out of the filth of the ditch onto the road. He moaned a little as they fussed about him, rolling Mick's sweater up to pillow his head and removing the man's jacket and tie. Quite suddenly, he opened his eyes. He stared at them both. "Are you all right?" Mick said. The man said nothing for a moment. He seemed not to understand. Then, "English," he said. His accent was thick, but the question was quite clear. "Yes." "I heard your voices. English." He frowned and winced. "Are you in pain?" said Judd. The man seemed to find this amusing. "Am I in pain?" he repeated, his face screwed up in a mixture of agony and delight. "I shall die," he said, through gritted teeth. "No," said Mick, "you're all right." The man shook his head, his authority absolute. "I shall die," he said again, the voice full of determination. "I want to die." Judd crouched closer to him. His voice was weaker by the moment. "Tell us what to do," he said. The man had closed his eyes. Judd shook him away, roughly. "Tell us," he said again, his show of compassion rapidly disappearing. "Tell us what this is all about." "About," said the man, his eyes still closed. "It was a fall, that's all. Just a fall." "What fell?" "The city. Oduyevo, my city." "What did it fall from?" "Itself, of course." The man was explaining nothing, just answering one riddle with another. "Where were you going?" Mick inquired, trying to sound as unaggressive as possible. "After Poporak," said the man. "Popolok," said Judd. Mick began to see some sense in the story. "Popolok is another city, like Poduyevo. Twin cities, they're on the map." "Where's the city now?" said Judd. Vaslav Yelovsek seemed to choose to tell the truth. There was a moment when he hovered between dying with a riddle on his lips and living long enough to unburden his story. What did it matter if the tale was told now? There could never be another contest. All that was over. "They came to fight," he said, his voice now very soft. "Poporak and Poduyevo, they came every 10 years. "Fight," said Judd. "You mean all those people were slaughtered?" Vaslav shook his head. "No, no. They fell. I told you." "Well, how do they fight?" Mick said. "Go into the hills," was the only reply. Vaslav opened his eyes a little. The faces that loomed over him were exhausted and sick. They had suffered, these innocents. They deserved some explanation. "As giants," he said. "They fought as giants. They made a body out of their bodies. Do you understand? The frame, the muscles, the bone, the eyes, nose, teeth, all made of men and women." "It's delirious," said Judd. "You go into the hills," the man repeated. "See for yourselves how true it is." "Even supposing," Mick began. Vaslav interrupted him, eager to be finished. "They were good at the game of giants. It took many centuries of practice, every 10 years making the figure larger and larger. One always ambitious to be larger than the other. Ropes to tie them all together flawlessly. Sinews, ligaments. There was food in its belly. There were pipes from the loins to take away the waste. The best sighted sat in the eye sockets. The best voiced in the mouth and throat. You wouldn't believe the engineering of it." "I don't," said Judd and stood up. "It is the body of the state, said Václav, so softly his voice was barely above a whisper. It is the shape of our lives. There was a silence. Small clouds passed over the road, soundlessly shedding their mass to the air. It was a miracle, he said. It was as if he realized the true enormity of the fact for the first time. It was a miracle. It was enough. Yes, it was quite enough. His mouth closed, the words said, and he died. Mick felt this death more acutely than the thousands they had fled from. Or rather, this death was the key to unlock the anguish he felt for them all. Whether the man had chosen to tell a fantastic lie as he died, or whether this story was in some way true, Mick felt useless in the face of it. His imagination was too narrow to encompass the idea. His brain ached with the thought of it, and his compassion cracked under the weight of misery he felt. They stood in the road while the clouds scudded by, their vague gray shadows passing over them toward the enigmatic hills. It was twilight. Popolok could stride no further. It felt exhaustion in every muscle. Here and there in its huge anatomy, deaths had occurred. But there was no grieving in the city for its deceased selves. If the dead were in the interior, the corpses were allowed to hang from their harnesses. If they formed the skin of the city, they were unbuckled from their positions and released to plunge into the forest below. The giant was not capable of pity. It had no ambition but to continue until it ceased. As the sun slunk out of sight, Popolok rested, sitting on a small hillock, nursing its huge head in its huge hands. The stars were coming out, with their familiar caution. Night was approaching, mercifully bandaging up the wounds of the day, blinding eyes that had seen too much. Popolok rose to its feet again and began to move, step by booming step. It would not be long, surely, before fatigue overcame it, before it could lie down in the tomb of some lost valley and die. But for a space yet it must walk on, each step more agonizingly slow than the last, while the night bloomed black around its head. Mick wanted to bury the car thief somewhere on the edge of the forest. Judd, however, pointed out that burying a body might seem, in tomorrow's saner light, a little suspicious. And besides, wasn't it absurd to concern themselves with one corpse when there were literally thousands of them lying a few miles from where they stood? The body was left to lie, therefore, and the car to sink deeper into the ditch. They began to walk again. It was cold, and colder by the moment, and they were hungry. But the few houses they passed were all deserted, locked and shuttered, every one. What did he mean, said Mick, as they stood looking at another locked door. He was talking metaphor. All that stuff about giants. It was some Trotskyist tripe, Judd insisted. I don't think so. I know so. It was his deathbed speech he'd probably been preparing for years. I don't think so, Mick said again, and began walking back toward the road. Oh, how's that? Judd was at his back. He wasn't towing some party line. Are you saying you think there's some giant around here someplace? For God's sake. Mick turned to Judd. His face was difficult to see in the twilight, but his voice was sober with belief. Yes, I think he was telling the truth. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. No. Judd hated Mick that moment. Hated his naivete, his passion to believe any half-witted story, if it had a whiff of romance about it. And this was the worst, the most preposterous. No, he said again. No, no, no. The sky was porcelain smooth, and the outline of the hills black as pitch. I'm fucking freezing, said Mick out of the ink. Are you staying here or walking with me? Judd shouted. We're not going to find anything this way. Well, it's a long way back. We're just going deeper into the hills. Do what you like. I'm walking. His footsteps receded. The dark encased him. After a minute, Judd followed. The night was cloudless and bitter. They walked on, their collars up against the chill, their feet swollen in their shoes. Above them, the whole sky had become a parade of stars, a triumph of spilled light from which the eye could make as many patterns as it had patience for. After a while, they slung their tired arms around each other for comfort and warmth. About 11 o'clock, they saw the glow of a window in the distance. The woman at the door of the stone cottage didn't smile, but she understood their condition and let them in. There seemed to be no purpose in trying to explain to either the woman or her crippled husband what they had seen. The cottage had no telephone, and there was no sign of a vehicle, so even had they found some way to express themselves, nothing could be done. With mimes and face-pullings, they explained that they were hungry and exhausted. They tried further to explain that they were lost, cursing themselves for leaving their phrase book in the VW. She didn't seem to understand very much of what they said, but sat them down beside a blazing fire and put a pan of food on the stove to heat. They ate thick, unsalted pea soup and eggs, and occasionally smiled their thanks at the woman. Her husband sat beside the fire, making no attempt to talk or even look at the visitors. The food was good. It buoyed their spirits. They would sleep until morning and then begin the long trek back. By dawn, the bodies in the field would be being quantified, identified, parceled up, and dispatched to their families. The air would be full of reassuring noises, canceling out the moans that still rang in their ears. There would be helicopters, lorry loads of men organizing the clearing up operations, all the rites and paraphernalia of a civilized disaster. And in a while it would be palatable. It would become part of their history, a tragedy, of course, but one they could explain, classify, and learn to live with. All would be well, yes, all would be well. Come morning. The sleep of sheer fatigue came on them suddenly. They lay where they had fallen, still sitting at the table, their heads on their crossed arms. A litter of empty bowls and bread crusts surrounded them. They knew nothing, dreamed nothing, felt nothing. Then the thunder began. In the earth, in the deep earth, a rhythmical tread as of a titan that came by degrees closer and closer. The woman woke her husband. She blew out the lamp and went to the door. The night sky was luminous with stars, the hills black on every side. The thunder still sounded, a full half minute between booms, but louder now, and louder with every new step. They stood at the door together, husband and wife, and listened to the night hills echo back and forth with the sound. There was no lightning to accompany the thunder, just the boom, boom, boom. It made the ground shake. It threw dust down from the door lintel and rattled the window latches. Boom. Boom. They didn't know what approached, but whatever shape it took and whatever it intended, there seemed no sense in running from it. Where they stood, in the pitiful shelter of their cottage, was as safe as any nook of the forest. How could they choose out of 100,000 trees which would be standing when the thunder had passed? Better to wait and watch. The wife's eyes were not good, and she doubted what she saw when the blackness of the hill changed shape and reared up to block the stars. But her husband had seen it too, the unimaginably huge head, vaster in the deceiving darkness, looming up and up, dwarfing the hills themselves with ambition. He fell to his knees, babbling a prayer, his arthritic legs twisted beneath him. His wife screamed. No words she knew could keep this monster at bay. No prayer, no plea had power over it. In the cottage, Mick woke and his outstretched arm, twitching with a sudden cramp, wiped the plate and the lamp off the table. They smashed. Judd woke. The screaming outside had stopped. The woman had disappeared from the doorway into the forest. Any tree at all, was better than this sight. Her husband still let a string of prayers dribble from his slack mouth as the great leg of the giant rose to take another step. Boom! The cottage shook. Plates danced and smashed off the dresser. A clay pipe rolled from the mantelpiece and shattered in the ashes of the hearth. The lovers knew the noise that sounded in their substance, that earth thunder. Mick reached for Judd and took him by the shoulder. "You see," he said, his teeth blue-gray in the darkness of the cottage. "See? See?" There was a kind of hysteria bubbling behind his words. He ran to the door, stumbling over a chair in the dark. Cursing and bruised, he staggered out into the night. Boom! The thunder was deafening. This time it broke all the windows in the cottage. In the bedroom, one of the roof joists cracked and flung debris downstairs. Judd joined his lover at the door. The old man was now face down on the ground, his sick and swollen fingers curled, his begging lips pressed to the damp soil. Mick was looking up toward the sky. Judd followed his gaze. There was a place that showed no stars. It was a darkness in the shape of a man, a vast, broad human frame, a colossus that soared up to meet heaven. It was not quite a perfect giant. Its outline was not tidy. It seethed and swarmed. He seemed broader, too, this giant, than any real man. His legs were abnormally thick and stumpy, and his arms were not long. The hands, as they clenched and unclenched, seemed oddly jointed and over-delicate for its torso. Then it raised one huge flat foot and placed it on the earth, taking a stride toward them. Boom! The step brought the roof collapsing in on the cottage. Everything that the car thief had said was true. Popelok was a city and a giant, and it had gone into the hills. Now their eyes were becoming accustomed to the nightlight. They could see in ever more horrible detail the way this monster was constructed. It was a masterpiece of human engineering, a man made entirely of men, or rather a sexless giant made of men and women and children. All the citizens of Popelok writhed and strained in the body of this flesh-knitted giant, their muscles stretched to breaking point, their bones close to snapping. They could see how the architects of Popelok had subtly altered the proportions of the human body, how the thing had been made squatter to lower its center of gravity, how its legs had been made elephantine to bear the weight of the torso, how the head was sunk low onto the wide shoulders so that the problems of a weak neck had been minimized. Despite these malformations, it was horribly lifelike. The bodies that were bound together to make its surface were naked but for their harnesses, so that its surface glistened in the starlight like one vast human torso. Even the muscles were well copied, though simplified. They could see the way the roped bodies pushed and pulled against each other in solid cords of flesh and bone. They could see the intertwined people that made up the body. The backs like turtles packed together to offer the sweep of the pectorals. The lashed and knotted acrobats at the joints of the arms and the legs alike, rolling and unwinding to articulate the city. But surely the most amazing sight of all was the face. Cheeks of bodies, cavernous eye sockets in which heads stared, 5 bound together for each eyeball, a broad, flat nose and a mouth that opened and closed as the muscles of the jaw bunched and hollowed rhythmically. And from that mouth, lined with teeth of bold children, the voice of the giant, now only a weak copy of its former power,
I'll be right
spoke
back.
a single note of idiot music. Popolok walked and Popolok sang. Was there ever a sight in Europe the equal of it? They watched Mick and Judd as it took another step toward them. The old man had wet his pants. Blubbering and begging, he dragged himself away from the ruined cottage into the surrounding trees, dragging his dead legs after him. The Englishmen remained where they stood, watching the spectacle as it approached. Neither dread nor horror touched them now, just an awe that rooted them to the spot. They knew this was a sight they could never hope to see again. This was the apex. After this, there was only common experience. Better to stay then, though every step brought death nearer. Better to stay and see the sight while it was still there to be seen. And if it killed them, this monster, then at least they would have glimpsed a miracle, known this terrible majesty for a brief moment. It seemed a fair exchange. Popolok was within 2 steps of the cottage. They could see the complexities of its structure quite clearly. The faces of the citizens were becoming detailed, white, sweat-wet, and content in their weariness. Some hung dead from their harnesses, their legs swinging back and forth like the hanged. Others, children particularly, had ceased to obey their training and had relaxed their positions, so that the form of the body was degenerating, beginning to seethe with the boils of rebellious cells. Yet it still walked, each step an incalculable effort of coordination and strength. Boom. The step that trod the cottage came sooner than they thought. Mick saw the leg raised, saw the faces of the people in the shin and ankle and foot. They were as big as he was now, all huge men chosen to take the full weight of this great creation. Many were dead. The bottom of the foot, he could see, was a jigsaw of crushed and bloody bodies, pressed to death under the weight of their fellow citizens. The foot descended with a roar. In a matter of seconds, the cottage was reduced to splinters and dust. Popolok blotted the sky utterly. It was, for a moment, the whole world, heaven and earth. Its presence filled the senses to overflowing. At this proximity, one look could not encompass it. The eye had to range backward and forward over its mass to take it all in. And even then the mind refused to accept the whole truth. A whirling fragment of stone, flung off from the cottage as it collapsed, struck Judd full in the face. In his head he heard the killing stroke like a ball hitting a wall. A play yard death. No pain, no remorse. Out like a light, a tiny, insignificant light. His death cry lost in the pandemonium, his body hidden in the smoke and darkness. Mick neither saw nor heard Judd die. He was too busy staring at the foot as it settled for a moment in the ruins of the cottage, while the other leg mustered the will to move. Mick took his chance. Howling like a banshee, he ran toward the leg, longing to embrace the monster. He stumbled in the wreckage and stood again, bloodied, to reach for the foot before it was lifted and he was left behind. There was a clamor of agonized breath as the message came to the foot that it must move. Mick saw the muscles of the shin bunch and marry as the leg began to lift. He made one last lunge at the limb as it began to leave the ground, snatching a harness or a rope or human hair or flesh itself. Anything to catch this passing miracle and be part of it. Better to go with it wherever it was going, serve it in its purpose, whatever that might be. Better to die with it than live without it. He caught the foot and found a safe purchase on its ankle. Screaming his sheer ecstasy at his success, he felt the great leg raised. and glanced down through the swirling dust to the spot where he had stood, already receding as the limb climbed. The earth was gone from beneath him. He was a hitchhiker with a god. The mere life he had left was nothing to him now, or ever. He would live with this thing, yes, he would live with it, seeing it and eating it with his eyes until he died of sheer gluttony. He screamed and howled and swung on the ropes, drinking up his triumph. Below, far below, he glimpsed Judd's body, curled up pale on the dark ground, irretrievable. Love and life and sanity were gone, gone like the memory of his name, or his sex, or his ambition. It all meant nothing, nothing at all. Boom. Boom. Hopperlock walked, the noise of its steps receding to the east. Hopperlock walked, the hum of its voice lost in the night. After a day, birds came, foxes came, flies, butterflies, wasps came. Judd moved, Judd shifted, Judd gave birth. In his belly, maggots warmed themselves. In a vixen's den, the good flesh of his thigh was fought over. After that, it was quick, the bones yellowing, the bones crumbling. Soon, an empty space, which he had once filled with breath and opinions. Darkness, light. Darkness, light. He interrupted neither with his name.
This has been The Books of Blood, Volume 1, written by Clive Barker, narrated by Simon Van.
Here's the next title in this series.
This is Audible. Audible Frontiers presents
All right,
Exile,
I need to do some more
written by
smoking.
R.A. Salvatore, narrated by Victor Bevine. Prelude. The monster lumbered along the quiet corridors of the Underdark, its 8 scaly legs occasionally scuffing the stone. It did not recoil at its own echoing sounds, fearing the revealing noise. Nor did it scurry for cover, expecting the rush of another predator. For even in the dangers of the Underdark, this creature knew only security, confident of its ability to defeat any foe. Its breath reeked of deadly poison. The hard edges of its claws dug deep gouges into solid stone, and the rows of spear-like teeth that lined its wicked maw could tear through the thickest of hides. But worst of all was the monster's gaze, the gaze of a basilisk, which could transmutate into solid stone any living thing it fell upon. This creature, huge and terrible, was among the greatest of its kind. It did not know fear. The hunter watched the basilisk pass, as he had watched it earlier that same day. The eight-legged monster was the intruder here, coming into the hunter's domain. He had witnessed the basilisk kill several of his rothae,
Had like
the
a
small cat-like creatures that
brush
enhanced
tip
his
that
table
you
with its
twist
poison
in it.
breath, and the rest of the herd had
Gets the
fled
medicine
blindly
on it.
down the endless tunnels,
Then you're able to
perhaps
brush
never
it.
to return.
And then
The hunter was angry. He watched now as the monster trudged down the narrow passageway, just the route the hunter had suspected it would take. He slid his weapons from their sheaths, gaining confidence, as always, as soon as he felt their fine balance. The hunter had
guys,
owned
I
them
got
since his
actually got
childhood,
I'll be right
and
back.
even after nearly 3 decades of almost constant use, they bore only the slightest hints of wear. Now they would be tested again. The hunter replaced his weapons and waited for the sound that would spur him to motion. A throaty growl stopped the basilisk in its tracks. The monster peered ahead curiously, though its poor eyes could distinguish little beyond a few feet. Again came the growl, and the basilisk hunched down, waiting for the challenger, its next victim, to spring out and die. Far behind, the hunter
No, I
came
got
out of
a
his cubby, running
appointment
impossibly
set for,
fast along
Monday.
the
We're
tiny
supposed to
cracks
call
and
me
spurs in the corridor
tomorrow
wall.
and set it up Monday.
In his magical cloak, his kawafwi, he was invisible against the stone, and with his agile and practiced movements, he made not a sound. He came impossibly silent, impossibly fast. The growl issued again from ahead of the basilisk, but had not come any closer. The impatient monster shuffled forward, anxious to get on with the killing. When the basilisk crossed under a low archway, an impenetrable globe of absolute darkness enveloped its head, and the monster stopped suddenly and took a step back, as the hunter knew it would.
Good.
The
Makes
hunter
it a lot
was
more
upon it
bearable.
then. He leaped from the passage wall, executing 3 separate actions before he ever reached his mark. First, he cast a simple spell, which lined the basilisk's head in glowing blue and purple flames. Next, he pulled his hood down over his face, for he did not need his eyes in battle, and against a basilisk, a stray gaze could only bring him doom. Then, drawing his deadly scimitars, he landed on the monster's back and ran up its scales to get to its head. The basilisk reacted as soon as the dancing flames outlined its head. They did not burn, but their outline made the monster an easy target. The basilisk spun back, but before its head had turned halfway, the first scimitar had dived into one of its eyes. The creature reared and thrashed, trying to get at the hunter. It breathed its noxious fumes and whipped its head about. The hunter was the faster. He kept behind the maw, out of death's way. His second scimitar found the basilisk's other eye. Then the hunter unleashed his fury. The basilisk was the intruder. It had killed his rothae. Blow after savage blow bashed into the monster's armored head, flecked off scales, and dived for the flesh beneath. The basilisk understood its peril, but still believed that it would win. It had always won, if it could only get its poisonous breath in line with the furious hunter. The second foe, the growling, feline foe, was upon the basilisk then, having sprung toward the flame-lined maw without fear. The great cat latched on and took no notice of the poisonous fumes, for it was a magical beast, impervious to such attacks. Panther claws dug deep lines into the basilisk's gums, letting the monster drink of its own blood. Behind the huge head, the hunter struck again and again, 100 times and more. Savagely, viciously, the scimitars slammed through the scaly armor, through the flesh, and through the skull, battering the basilisk down into the blackness of death. Long after the monster lay still, the pounding of the bloodied scimitars slowed. The hunter removed his hood and inspected the broken pile of gore at his feet and the hot stains of blood on his blades. He raised the dripping scimitars into the air and proclaimed his victory with a scream of primal exultation. He was the hunter, and this was his home.
All right.
When he had thrown all of his rage out in that scream, though, the hunter looked upon his companion and was ashamed. The panther's saucer eyes judged him, even if the panther did not.
At least volume 1.
The cat was the hunter's only link to the past, to the civilized existence the hunter once had known. "Come, Guinevere," he whispered, as he slid the scimitars back into their sheaths. He reveled in the sound of the words as he spoke them. It was the only voice he had heard for a decade, but every time he spoke now, the words seemed more foreign and came to him with difficulty. Would he lose that ability too, as he had lost every other aspect of his former existence? This the hunter feared greatly, for without his voice, he could not summon the panther. He then truly would be alone. Down the quiet corridors of the Underdark went the hunter and his cat, making not a sound, disturbing no rubble. Together, they had come to know the dangers of this hushed world. Together they had learned to survive. Despite the victory, though, the hunter wore no smile this day. He feared no foes, but was no longer certain whether his courage came from confidence or from apathy about living. Perhaps survival was not enough. Part 1. The Hunter. I remember vividly the day I walked away from the city of my birth, the city of my people. All the Underdark lay before me, a life of adventure and excitement, with possibilities that lifted my heart. More than that, though, I left Menzo Berenzon with the belief that I could now live my life in accordance with my principles. I had Guinevere at my side and my scimitars belted on my hips. My future was my own to determine. But that drow, the young Drizzt Do'Urden who walked out of Menzo Berenzon on that fated day, barely into my 4th decade of life, could not begin to understand the truth of time, of how its passage seemed to slow when the moments were not shared with others. In my youthful exuberance, I looked forward to several centuries of life. How do you measure centuries when a single hour seems a day and a single day seems a year? Beyond the cities of the Underdark, there is food for those who know how to find it, and safety for those who know how to hide. More than anything else, though, beyond the teeming cities of the Underdark, there is solitude. As I became a creature of the empty tunnels, survival became easier and more difficult all at once. I gained in the physical skills and experience necessary to live on. I could defeat almost anything that wandered into my chosen domain, and those few monsters that I could not defeat, I could surely flee or hide from. It did not take me long, however, to discover one nemesis that I could neither defeat nor flee. It followed me wherever I went. Indeed, the farther I ran, the more it closed in around me. My enemy was solitude, the interminable, incessant silence of hushed corridors. Looking back on it these many years later, I find myself amazed and appalled at the changes I endured under such an existence. The very identity of every reasoning being is defined by the language, the communication between that being and others around it. Without that link, I was lost. When I left Menzo Berenzon, I determined that my life would be based on principles, my strength adhering to unbending beliefs. Yet after only a few months alone in the Underdark, the only purpose for my survival was my survival. I had become a creature of instinct, calculating and cunning, but not thinking, not using my mind for anything more than directing the newest kill. Guinevere saved me, I believe. The same companion that had pulled me from certain death in the clutches of monsters unnumbered rescued me from a death of emptiness. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less fatal. I found myself living for those moments when the cat could walk by my side, when I had another living creature to hear my words, strange though they had become. In addition to every other value, Guinevere became my time clock, for I knew that the cat could come forth from the astral plane for a half day every other day. Only after my ordeal had ended did I realize how critical that 1/4 of my time actually was. Without Guinevere, I would not have found the resolve to continue. I would never have maintained the strength to survive. Even when Guinevere stood beside me, I found myself growing more and more ambivalent toward the fighting. I was secretly hoping that some denizen of the Underdark would prove stronger than I. Could the pain of tooth or talon be greater than the emptiness and the silence? I think not. Drizzt Do'Urden. 1. Anniversary present. Matron Malice Do'Urden shifted uneasily on the stone throne in the small and darkened anteroom to the great chapel of House Do'Urden. To the Dark Elves, who measured time's passage in decades, this was a day to be marked in the annals of Malice's house, the 10th anniversary of the ongoing covert conflict between the Do'Urden family and House Hunnet. Matron Malice, never one to miss a celebration, had a special present prepared for her enemies. Breeza Do'Urden, Malice's eldest daughter, a large and powerful drow female, paced about the anteroom anxiously, a not uncommon sight. "It should be finished by now," she grumbled as she kicked a small 3-legged stool. It skidded and tumbled, chipping away a piece of mushroom stem seat. "Patience, my daughter," Malice replied, somewhat recriminatory, though she shared Breeza's sentiments. "Jarlaxle is a careful one." Breeza turned away at the mention of the outrageous mercenary and moved to the room's ornately carved stone doors. Malice did not miss the significance of her daughter's actions. "You do not approve of Jarlaxle and his band," the matron mother stated flatly. "They are houseless rogues," Breeza spat in response, still not turning to face her mother. "There is no place in Menzo Berenzon for houseless rogues. They disrupt the natural order of our society, and they are males." "They serve us well," Malice reminded her. Breeza wanted to argue about the extreme cost of hiring the mercenary band, but she wisely held her tongue. She and Malice had been at odds almost continually since the start of the Do'Urden-Hunnet War. "Without Bregan the Earth, we could not take action against our enemies," Malice continued. "Using the mercenaries, the houseless rogues as you have named them, allows us to wage war without implicating our house as the perpetrator." "Then why not be done with it?" Breeza demanded, spinning back toward the throne. "We kill a few of Hunnet's soldiers, they kill a few of ours, and all the while both houses continue to recruit replacements. It will not end. The only winners in the conflict are the mercenaries of Bregan the Earth, and whatever band matron Sinafe Hunnet has hired, feeding off the coffers of both houses." "Watch your tone, my daughter," Malice growled as an angry reminder. "You are addressing a matron mother." Breeza turned away again. "We should have attacked House Hunnet immediately, on the night Zaknavain was sacrificed," she dared to grumble. "You forget the actions of your youngest brother on that night," Malice replied evenly. But the matron mother was wrong. If she lived 1,000 more years, Breeza would not forget Drizzt's actions on the night he had forsaken his family. Trained by Zaknavain, Malice's favorite lover and reputedly the finest weapon master in all of Menzo Berenzon, Drizzt had achieved a level of fighting ability far beyond the drow norm. But Zack had also given Drizzt the troublesome and blasphemous attitudes that Lolth, the Spider Queen deity of the Dark Elves, would not tolerate. Finally, Drizzt's sacrilegious ways had invoked Lolth's wrath, and the Spider Queen in turn had demanded his death. Matron Malice, impressed by Drizzt's potential as a warrior, had acted boldly on Drizzt's behalf, and had given Zaknavain's heart to Lolth to compensate for Drizzt's sins. She forgave Drizzt in the hope that without Zaknavain's influences, he would amend his ways and replace the deposed weapon master. In return, though, the ungrateful Drizzt had betrayed them all, had run off into the Underdark, an act that not only had robbed House Do'Urden of its only potential remaining weapon master, but also had placed Matron Malice and the rest of the Do'Urden family out of Lolth's favor. In the disastrous end of all their efforts, House Do'Urden had lost its premier weapon master, the favor of Lolth, and its would-be weapon master. It had not been a good day. Luckily, House Hunnet had suffered similar woes on that same day, losing both its wizards in a botched attempt to assassinate Drizzt. With both houses weakened and in Lolth's disfavor, the expected war had been turned into a calculated series of covert raids. Breeza would never forget. A knock on the anteroom door startled Breeza and her mother from their private memories of that fateful time. The door swung open, and Dinan, the elder boy of the house, walked in. "Greetings, Matron Mother," he said, in an appropriate manner and dipping into a low bow. Dinan wanted his news to be a surprise, but the grin that found its way onto his face revealed everything. "Jarlaxle has returned," Malice snarled in glee. Dinan turned toward the open door, and the mercenary, waiting patiently in the corridor, strode in. Breeza, ever amazed at the rogue's unusual mannerisms, shook her head as Jarlaxle walked past her. Nearly every dark elf in Menzoberranzan dressed in a quiet and practical manner, in robes adorned with the symbols of the Spider Queen, or in supple chain-link armor under the folds of a magical and camouflaging Pewafwi cloak. Jarlaxle, arrogant and brash, followed few of the customs of Menzoberranzan's inhabitants. He was most certainly not the norm of Drow society, and he flaunted the differences openly, brazenly. He wore not a cloak, nor a robe, but a shimmering cape that showed every color of the spectrum, both in the glow of light and in the infrared spectrum of heat-sensing eyes. The cape's magic could only be guessed, but those closest to the mercenary leader indicated that it was very valuable indeed. Jarlaxle's vest was sleeveless and cut so high that his slender and tightly muscled stomach was open for all to view. He kept a patch over one eye, though careful observers would understand it as ornamental, for Jarlaxle often shifted it from one eye to the other. "My dear Breeza," Jarlaxle said over his shoulder, noting the High Priestess's disdainful interest in his appearance. He spun about and bowed low, sweeping off the wide-brimmed hat, another oddity, and even more so since the hat was overly plumed in the monstrous feathers of a diatrema, a gigantic Underdark bird, as he stooped. Breeza huffed and turned away at the sight of the mercenary's dipping head. Drow elves wore their thick white hair as a mantle of their station, each cut designed to reveal rank and house affiliation. Jarlaxle the rogue wore no hair at all, and from Breeza's angle, his clean-shaven head appeared as a ball of pressed onyx. Jarlaxle laughed quietly at the continuing disapproval of the eldest Do'Urden daughter and turned back toward Matron Malice, his ample jewelry tinkling and his hard and shiny boots clumping with every step. Breeza took note of this as well, for she knew that those boots and that jewelry only seemed to make noise when Jarlaxle wished them to do so. "Is it done?" Matron Malice asked, before the mercenary could even begin to offer a proper greeting. "My dear Matron Malice," Jarlaxle replied with a pained sigh, knowing that he could get away with the informalities in light of his grand news. "Did you doubt me? Surely I am wounded to my heart." Malice leaped from her throne, her fist clenched in victory. "Pt.3 Hunnet is dead," she proclaimed. "The first noble victim of the war." "You forget Massage Hunnet," remarked Breeza, "slain by Drizzt 10 years ago. And Zaknafein Do'Urden," Breeza had to add against her better judgment, "killed by your own hand." "Zaknafein was not noble by birth," Malice sneered at her impertinent daughter. Breeza's words stung Malice nonetheless. Malice had decided to sacrifice Zaknafein in Drizzt's stead against Breeza's recommendations. Jarlaxle cleared his throat to deflect the growing tension. The mercenary knew that he had to finish his business and be out of House Do'Urden as quickly as possible. Already he knew, though the Do'Urdens did not, that the appointed hour drew near. "There is the matter of my payment," he reminded Malice. Dinan will see to it, Malice replied with a wave of her hand, not turning her eyes from her daughter's pernicious stare. I will take my leave, Jarlaxle said, nodding to the elder boy. Before the mercenary had taken his first step toward the door, Vierna, Malice's second daughter, burst into the room, her face glowing brightly in the infrared spectrum, heated with obvious excitement. Damn, Jarlaxle whispered under his breath. What is it? Matron Malice demanded. House Hannet, Vierna cried. Soldiers in the compound. We are under attack. Out in the courtyard, beyond the cavern complex, nearly 500 soldiers of House Hannet, fully 100 more than the house reportedly possessed, followed the blast of a lightning bolt through House Do'Urden's adamantite gates. The 350 soldiers of the Do'Urden household swarmed out of the shaped stalagmite mounds that served as their quarters to meet the attack. Outnumbered but trained by Zachnofane, the Do'Urden troops formed into proper defensive positions, shielding their wizards and clerics so that they might cast their spells. An entire contingent of Hunnet soldiers, empowered with enchantments of flying, swooped down the cavern wall that housed the royal chambers of House Do'Urden. Tiny handheld crossbows clicked and thinned the ranks of the aerial force with deadly poison-tipped darts. The aerial invaders' surprise had been achieved, though, and the Do'Urden troops were quickly put into a precarious position. Hannet has not the favor of Lolth, Malice screamed. It would not dare to openly attack. She flinched at the refuting, thunderous sounds of another, and then still another bolt of lightning. Oh, Breeza snapped. Malice cast her daughter a threatening glare, but didn't have time to continue the argument. The normal method of attack by a drow house would involve the rush of soldiers combined with a mental barrage by the house's highest-ranking clerics. Malice, though, felt no mental attack, which told her beyond any doubt that it was indeed House Hannet that had come to her gates. The clerics of Hannet, out of the Spider Queen's favor, apparently could not use their Lolth-given powers to launch the mental assault. If they had, Malice and her daughters, also out of the Spider Queen's favor, could not have hoped to counter. Why would they dare to attack? Malice wondered aloud.
Yeah.
Breeza understood her mother's reasoning. They are bold indeed, she said, to hope that their soldiers alone can eliminate every member of our house. Everyone in the room, every drow in Menzo Baranzon, understood the brutal, absolute punishments exacted upon any house that failed to eradicate another house. Such attacks were not frowned upon, but getting caught at the deed most certainly was. Risen, the present patron of House Do'Urden, came into the anteroom then, his face grim. We are outnumbered and outpositioned, he said. Our defeat will be swift, I fear. Malice would not accept the news. She struck Risen with a blow that knocked the patron halfway across the floor. Then she spun on Jarlaxle. You must summon your band, Malice cried at the mercenary. Quickly! Matron, Jarlaxle stuttered, obviously at a loss. Brigand Earth is a secretive group. We do not engage in open warfare. To do so could invoke the wrath of the ruling council. I will pay you whatever you desire, the desperate matron mother promised. But the cost, whatever you desire, Malice snarled again. Such action, Jarlaxle began. Again, Malice did not let him finish his argument. Save my house, mercenary, she growled. Your profits will be great, but I warn you the cost of your failure will be far greater. Jarlaxle did not appreciate being threatened, especially by a lame matron mother whose entire world was fast crumbling around her. But in the mercenary's ears, the sweet ring of the word profits outweighed the threat 1,000 times over. After 10 straight years of exorbitant rewards in the Do'Urden Hannet conflict, Jarlaxle did not doubt Malice's willingness or ability to pay as promised, nor did he doubt that this deal would prove even more lucrative than the agreement he had struck with matron Sinafe Hannet earlier that same 10-day. As you wish, he said to matron Malice with a bow and a sweep of his garish hat. I will see what I can do. A wink at Dinan set the elder boy on his heels as he exited the room. When the two got out on the balcony overlooking the Doerden compound, they saw that the situation was even more desperate than Risen had described. The soldiers of House Doerden, those still alive, were trapped in and around one of the huge stalagmite mounds anchoring the front gate. One of Hunnet's flying soldiers dropped onto the balcony at the sight of a Doerden noble, but Deenan dispatched the intruder with a single blurring attack routine. "Well done," Jarlaxle commented, giving Deenan an approving nod. He moved to pat the elder boy Doerden on the shoulder, but Deenan slipped out of reach. "We have other business," he pointedly reminded Jarlaxle. "Call your troops and quickly, else I fear that House Hunnet will win the day." "Be at ease, my friend Deenan," Jarlaxle laughed. He pulled a small whistle from around his neck and blew into it. Deenan heard not a sound, for the instrument was magically tuned exclusively for the ears of members of Bregan the Earth. The elder boy Doerden watched in amazement as Jarlaxle calmly puffed out a specific cadence. Then he watched in even greater amazement as more than 100 of House Hunnet soldiers turned against their comrades. Bregan the Earth owed allegiance only to Bregan the Earth. "They could not attack us," Malice said stubbornly, pacing about the chamber. "The Spider Queen would not aid them in their venture." "They are winning without the Spider Queen's aid," Risen reminded her, prudently ducking into the room's farthest corner, even as he spoke the unwanted words. "You said that they would never attack," Breeza growled at her mother, "even as you explained why we could not dare to attack them." Breeza remembered that conversation vividly, for it was she who had suggested the open attack on House Hunnet. Malice had scolded her harshly and publicly, and now Breeza meant to return the humiliation. Her voice dripped of angry sarcasm as she aimed each word at her mother. "Could it be that Matron Malice Doerden has erred?" Malice's reply came in the form of a glare that wavered somewhere between rage and terror. Breeza returned the threatening look without ambiguity, and suddenly the matron mother of House Doerden did not feel so very invincible and sure of her actions. She started forward nervously a moment later when Maya, the youngest of the Doerden daughters, entered the room. "They have breached the house," Breeza cried, assuming the worst. She grabbed at her snake-headed whip. "And we have not even begun our preparations for defense." "No," Maya quickly corrected. "No enemies have crossed the balcony. The battle has turned against House Hunnet." "As I knew it would," Malice observed, pulling herself straight and speaking pointedly at Breeza. "Foolish is the house that moves without the favor of Lolth." Despite her proclamation, though, Malice guessed that more than the judgment of the Spider Queen had come into play out in the courtyard. Her reasoning led her inescapably to Jarlaxle and his untrustworthy band of rogues. Jarlaxle stepped off the balcony and used his innate drow abilities to levitate down to the cavern floor. Seeing no need to involve himself in a battle that was obviously under control, Deenan rested back and watched the mercenary go, considering all that had just transpired. Jarlaxle had played both sides off against the other, and once again the mercenary and his band had been the only true winners. Bregan the Earth was undeniably unscrupulous, but Deenan had to admit, undeniably effective. Deenan found that he liked the renegade. "The accusation has been properly delivered to Matron Baenri?" Malice asked Breeza when the light of Narbendel, the magically heated stalagmite mound that served as the time clock of Menzo Baranzan, began its steady climb, marking the dawn of the next day. "The ruling house expected the visit," Breeza replied with a smirk. "All of the city whispers of the attack, and of how House Doerden repelled the invaders of House Hunnet." Malice futilely tried to hide her vain smile. She enjoyed the attention and the glory that she knew would be lavished upon her house. "The ruling council will be convened this very day," Breeza went on. "No doubt to the dismay of Matron Sinafe Hunnet and her doomed children." Malice nodded her agreement. To eradicate a rival house in Menzo Baranzan was a perfectly acceptable practice among the Drow. But to fail in the attempt, to leave even one witness of noble blood alive to make an accusation, invited the judgment of the ruling council, a wrath that wrought absolute destruction in its wake. A knock turned them both toward the room's ornate door. You are summoned, matron, Risen said as he entered. Matron Baenri has sent a chariot for you. Malice and Breeza exchanged hopeful but nervous glances. When punishment fell upon House Hunnet, House de Werden would move into the 8th rank of the city hierarchy, a most desirable position. Only the matron mothers of the top 8 houses were accorded a seat on the city's ruling council. Already? Breeza asked her mother. Malice only shrugged in reply and followed Risen out of the room and down to the house's balcony. Risen offered her a hand of assistance, which she promptly and stubbornly slapped away. Her pride apparent with every move, Malice stepped over the railing and floated down to the courtyard, where the bulk of her remaining soldiery was gathered. The floating, blue-glowing disc bearing the insignia of House Baenri hovered just outside the blasted adamantite gate of the Doerden compound. Malice proudly strode through the gathered crowd. Dark elves fell over each other, trying to get out of her way. This was her day, she decided, the day she achieved the seat on the ruling council, the position she so greatly deserved. Matron Mother, I will accompany you through the city, offered Denon, standing at the gate. You will remain here with the rest of the family, Malice corrected. The summons is for me alone. How can you know? Denon questioned, but he realized he had overstepped his rank as soon as the words had left his mouth. By the time Malice turned her reprimanding glare toward him, he had already disappeared into the mob of soldiers. Proper respect, Malice muttered under her breath, and she instructed the nearest soldiers to remove a section of the propped and tied gate. With a final victorious glance at her subjects, Malice stepped out and took a seat on the floating disc. This was not the first time that Malice had accepted such an invitation from Matron Baenri, so she was not the least bit surprised when several Baenri clerics moved out from the shadows to encircle the floating disc in a protective guard. The last time Malice had made this trip, she had been tentative, not really understanding Baenri's intent in summoning her. This time, no. Malice folded her arms defiantly across her chest and let the curious onlookers view her in all the splendor of her victory. Malice accepted the stares proudly, feeling positively superior. Even when the disc reached the fabulous web-like fence of House Baenri, with its 1,000 marching guards and towering stalagmite and stalactite structures, Malice's pride had not diminished. She was of the ruling council now, or soon would be. No longer did she have to feel intimidated anywhere in the city. Or so she thought. Your presence is requested in the chapel, one of Baenri's clerics said to her, when the disc came to a stop at the base of the great domed building's sweeping stairs. Malice stepped down and ascended the polished stones. As soon as she entered, she noticed a figure sitting on one of the chairs atop the raised central altar. The seated drow, the only other person visible in the chapel, apparently did not notice that Malice had entered. She sat back comfortably, watching the huge illusionary image at the top of the dome shift through its forms, first appearing as a gigantic spider, then a beautiful drow female. As she moved closer, Malice recognized the robes of a matron mother, and she assumed, as she had all along, that it was Matron Baenri herself, the most powerful figure in all of Menzo Baranzon, awaiting her. Malice made her way up the altar's stairs, coming up behind the seated drow. Not waiting for an invitation, she boldly walked around to greet the other matron mother. It was not, however, the ancient and emaciated form of Matron Baenri that Malice Doerden encountered on the dais of the Baenri chapel. The seated matron mother was not old beyond the years of a drow, and as withered and dried as some bloodless corpse. Indeed, this drow was no older than Malice and quite diminutive. Malice recognized her all too well. "Sinafe!" she cried, nearly toppling. "Malice?" the other replied calmly. 1,000 troublesome possibilities rolled through Malice's mind. Sinafe Hunnet should have been huddling in fear in her doomed house, awaiting the annihilation of her family. Yet here Sinafe sat, comfortably, in the hallowed quarters of Menzo Baranzon's most important family. "You do not belong in this place," Malice protested, her slender fists clenched at her side. She considered the possibilities of attacking her rival then and there, of throttling Sina Fey with her own hands. "Be at ease, Malice," Sina Fey remarked casually. "I am here by the invitation of Matron Baenri, as are you." The mention of Matron Baenri and the reminder of where they were calmed Malice considerably. One did not act out of sorts in the chapel of House Baenri. Malice moved to the opposite end of the circular dais and took a seat, her gaze never leaving the smugly smiling face of Sina Fey Hannet. After a few interminable moments of silence, Malice had to speak her mind. "It was House Hannet that attacked my family in the last dark of Narbondel," she said. "I have many witnesses to the fact, there can be no doubt." "None," Sina Fey replied, her agreement catching Malice off her guard. "You admit the deed?" she balked. "Indeed," said Sina Fey. "Never have I denied it." "Yet you live," Malice sneered. "The laws of Menzoberranzan demand justice upon you and your house." "Justice?" Sina Fey laughed at the absurd notion. Justice had never been more than a facade and a means of keeping the pretense of order in chaotic Menzoberranzan. "I acted as the Spider Queen demanded of me." "If the Spider Queen approved of your methods, you would have been victorious," Malice reasoned. "Not so," interrupted another voice. Malice and Sina Fey turned about just as Matron Baenri magically appeared, sitting comfortably in the chair farthest back on the dais. Malice wanted to scream out at the withered matron mother, both for spying on her conversation and for apparently refuting her claims against Sina Fey. Malice had managed to survive the dangers of Menzoberranzan for 500 years, though, primarily because she understood the implications of angering one such as Matron Baenri. "I claim the rights of accusation against House Hannet," she said calmly. "Granted," replied Matron Baenri. "As you have said, and as Sina Fey agreed, there can be no doubt." Malice turned triumphantly on Sina Fey, but the matron mother of House Hannet still sat relaxed and unconcerned. "And why is she here?" Malice cried, her tone edged in explosive violence. "Sina Fey is an outlaw, she—" "We have not argued against your words," Matron Baenri interrupted. "House Hannet attacked and failed. The penalties for such a deed are well known and agreed upon, and the ruling council will convene this very day to see that justice is carried through." "Then why is Sina Fey here?" Malice demanded. "Do you doubt the wisdom of my attack?" Sina Fey asked Malice, trying to keep a chuckle under her breath. "You were defeated," Malice reminded her matter-of-factly. "That alone should provide your answer." "Lolth demanded the attack," said Matron Baenri. "Why then was House Hannet defeated?" Malice asked stubbornly. "If the Spider Queen—" "I do not say that the Spider Queen had imbued her blessings upon House Hannet," Matron Baenri interrupted, somewhat crossly. Malice shifted back in her seat, remembering her place and her predicament. "I said only that Lolth demanded the attack," Matron Baenri continued. "For 10 years, all of Menzoberranzan has suffered the spectacle of your private war. The intrigue and excitement wore away long ago, let me assure you both. It had to be decided." "And it was," declared Malice, rising from her seat. "House Do'Urden has proven victorious, and I claim the rights of accusation against Sina Fey Hannet and her family." "Sit down, Malice," Sina Fey said. "There is more to this than your simple rights of accusation." Malice looked to Matron Baenri for confirmation, though considering the present situation, she could not doubt Sina Fey's words. "It is done," Matron Baenri said to her. "House Do'Urden has won, and House Hannet will be no more." Malice fell back into her seat, smiling smugly at Sina Fey. Still, though, the matron mother of House Hannet did not seem the least bit concerned. "I will watch the destruction of your house with great pleasure," Malice assured her rival. She turned to Baenri. "When will punishment be exacted?" It is already done, Matron Behenry replied mysteriously.
Sina Fe lives,
Malice cried. No, the withered matron mother corrected. She who was Sina Fe Hanet lives. Now Malice was beginning to understand. House Behenry had always been opportunistic. Could it be that Matron Behenry was stealing the high priestesses of House Hanet to add to her own collection?
You will shelter her?
Malice dared to ask. No, Matron Behenry replied evenly. That task will fall to you. Malice's eyes went wide. Of all the many duties she had ever been appointed in her days as a high priestess of Loth, she could think of none more distasteful.
She is my enemy. You ask that I give her shelter?
She is your daughter, Matron Behenry shot back. Her tone softened, and a wry smile cracked her thin lips. Your oldest daughter, returned from travels to Chetnasad or some other city of our kin.
Why are you doing this?
Malice demanded.
It is unprecedented.
Not completely correct, replied Matron Behenry. Her fingers tapped together out in front of her while she sank back within her thoughts, remembering some of the strange consequences of the endless line of battles within the Drow city. Outwardly, your observations are correct, she continued to explain to Malice. But surely you are wise enough to know that many things occur behind the appearances in Menzoberranzan. House Hanet must be destroyed. That cannot be changed. And all of the nobles of House Hanet must be slaughtered. It is, after all, the civilized thing to do. She paused a moment to ensure that Malice was fully comprehending the meaning of her next statement. They must appear, at least, to be slaughtered.
And you will arrange this?
Malice asked. I already have, Matron Behenry assured her.
But what is the purpose?
When House Hanet initiated its attack against you, did you call upon the Spider Queen in your struggles? Matron Behenry asked bluntly. The question startled Malice, and the expected answer upset her more than a little. And when House Hanet was repelled, Matron Behenry went on coldly, did you give praise to the Spider Queen? Did you call upon a handmaiden of Loth in your moment of victory, Malice Do'Urden?
Am I on trial here?
Malice cried.
You know the answer, Matron Behenry.
She looked at Sina Fe uncomfortably as she replied, fearing that she might be giving some valued information away.
You are aware of my situation concerning the Spider Queen. I dare not summon a Yochlol until I have seen some sign that I have regained Loth's favor.
I got it about a
And you have
quarter of it
seen no
left.
sign?
Sina Fe remarked.
None other than the defeat of my rival.
Malice growled back at her. That was not a sign from the Spider Queen, Matron Behenry assured them both. Loth did not involve herself in your struggles. She only demanded that they be finished.
Is she pleased at the outcome?
Malice asked bluntly. That is yet to be determined, replied Matron Behenry. Many years ago, Loth made clear her desires that Malice Do'Urden sit upon the ruling council. Beginning with the next light of Narbondale, it shall be so. Malice's chin rose with pride. But understand your dilemma, Matron Behenry scolded her, rising up out of her chair. Malice slumped back immediately. You have lost more than half of your soldiers, Behenry explained, and you do not have a large family surrounding and supporting you. You rule the 8th house of the city, yet it is known by all that you are not in the Spider Queen's favor. How long do you believe House Do'Urden will hold its position? Your seat on the ruling council is in jeopardy even before you have assumed it. Malice could not refute the ancient matron's logic. They both knew the ways of Menzoberranzan. With House Do'Urden so obviously crippled, some lesser house would soon take advantage of the opportunity to better its station. The attack by House Hunnet would not be the last battle fought in the Doerden compound. So I give to you Sina Fe Hunnet, Shinena Doerden, a new daughter, a new high priestess, said Matron Bayenry. She turned then to Sina Fe to continue her explanation. But Malice found herself suddenly distracted as a voice called out to her in her thoughts, a telepathic message. Keep her only as long as you need her, Malice Doerden, it said. Malice looked around, guessing the source of the communication. On a previous visit to House Bayenry, she had met Matron Bayenry's mind flayer, a telepathic beast. The creature was nowhere in sight, but neither had Matron Bayenry been when Malice had first entered the chapel. Malice looked around alternately at the remaining empty seats atop the dais, but the stone furniture showed no signs of any occupants. A second telepathic message left her no doubts. You will know when the time is right. And the remaining 50 of House Hunnet's soldiers, Matron Bayenry was saying. Do you agree, Matron Malice? Malice looked at Sina Fe, an expression that might have been acceptance or wicked irony. I do, she replied. Go then, Shinena Doerden, Matron Bayenry instructed Sina Fe. Join your remaining soldiers in the courtyard. My wizards will get you to House Doerden in secrecy. Sina Fe cast a suspicious glance Malice's way, then moved out of the great chapel. I understand, Malice said to her hostess when Sina Fe had gone. You understand nothing, Matron Bayenry yelled back at her, suddenly enraged. I have done all that I may for you, Malice Doerden. It was Lolth's wish that you sit upon the ruling council, and I have arranged, at great personal cost, for that to be so. Malice knew then, beyond any doubt, that House Bayenry had prompted House Hunnet to action. How deep did Matron Bayenry's influence go, Malice wondered. Perhaps the withered matron mother also had anticipated, and possibly arranged, the actions of Jarlaxle and the soldiers of Bregan the Earth, ultimately the deciding factor in the battle. She would have to find out about that possibility, Malice promised herself. Jarlaxle had dipped his greedy fingers quite deeply into her purse. No more, Matron Bayenry continued. Now you are left to your own wiles. You have not found the favor of Lolth, and that is the only way you and House Doerden will survive. Malice's fist clenched the arm of her chair so tightly that she almost expected to hear the stone cracking beneath it. She had hoped, with the defeat of House Hunnet, that she had put the blasphemous deeds of her youngest son behind her. You know what must be done, said Matron Bayenry. Correct the wrong, Malice. I have put myself forward on your behalf. I will not tolerate continued failure. The arrangements have been explained to us, Matron Mother, Dinan said to Malice when she returned to the adamantite gate of House Doerden. He followed Malice across the compound and then levitated up beside her to the balcony outside the noble quarters of the house. All of the family is gathered in the anteroom, Dinan went on. Even the newest member, he added with a wink. Malice did not respond to her son's feeble attempt at humor. She pushed Dinan aside roughly and stormed down the central corridor, commanding the anteroom door to open with a single powerful word. The family scrambled out of her way as she crossed to her throne on the far side of the spider-shaped table. They had anticipated a long meeting to learn the new situation confronting them and the challenges they must overcome. What they got instead was a brief glimpse at the rage burning within Matron Malice. She glared at them alternately, letting each of them know beyond any doubt that she would not accept anything less than she demanded.
Good to see you.
Her voice grating as though her mouth were filled with pebbles, she growled, "Find Drizzt and bring him to me." Breeza started to protest, but Malice shot her a glare so utterly cold and threatening that it stole the words away. The eldest daughter, as stubborn as her mother and always ready for an argument, averted her eyes. And no one else in the anteroom, though they shared Breeze's unspoken concerns, made any motion to argue. Malice then left them to sort out the specifics of how they would accomplish the task. Details were not at all important to Malice. The only part she meant to play in all of this was the thrust of the ceremonial dagger into her youngest son's chest. 2. Voices in the dark.
Right. Hope you had a
Drizzt
good day.
stretched
Stewie.
away his weariness and forced himself to his feet. The efforts of his battle against the basilisk the night before, of slipping fully into that primal state so necessary for survival, had drained him thoroughly. Yet Drizzt knew that he could afford no more rest. His Rothe herd, the guaranteed food supply, had been scattered among the maze of tunnels and had to be retrieved. Drizzt quickly surveyed the small and unremarkable cave that served as his home, ensuring that all was as it should be. His eyes lingered on the onyx statuette of the panther. He was held by a profound longing for Guinevere's companionship. In his ambush of the basilisk, Drizzt had kept the panther by his side for a long period, nearly the entire night, and Guinevere would need to rest back on the astral plane. More than a full day would pass before Drizzt could bring arrested Guinevere forth again, and to attempt to use the figurine before then in any but a desperate situation would be foolish. With a resigned shrug, Drizzt dropped the statuette into his pocket and tried vainly to dismiss his loneliness. After a quick inspection of the rock barricade blocking the entrance to the main corridor, Drizzt moved to the smaller crawl tunnel at the back of the cave. He noticed the scratches on the wall by the tunnel, the notches he had scrawled to mark the passage of the days. Drizzt absently scraped another one now, but realized that it was not important. How many times had he forgotten to scratch the mark? How many days had slipped past him unnoticed between the hundreds of scratches on that wall? Somehow it no longer seemed to matter. Day and night were one, and all the days were one in the life of the hunter. Drizzt hauled himself up into the tunnel and crawled for many minutes toward the dim light source at the other end. Though the presence of light, the result of the glow of an unusual type of fungus, normally would have been uncomfortable to a dark elf's eyes, Drizzt felt a sincere sense of security as he crossed through the crawl tunnel into the long chamber. Its floor was broken into 2 levels, the lower being a moss-filled bed crossed by a small stream, and the upper being a grove of towering mushrooms. Drizzt headed for the grove, though he was not normally welcome there. He knew that the Myconids, the fungus men, a weird cross between humanoid and toadstool, were watching him anxiously. The basilisk had come in here in its first travels to the region, and the Myconids had suffered a great loss. Now they were no doubt scared and dangerous, but Drizzt suspected that they knew as well that it was he who had slain the monster. Myconids were not stupid beings. If Drizzt kept his weapons sheathed and made no unexpected moves, the fungus men probably would accept his passage through their tended grove. The wall to the upper tier was more than 10 feet high and nearly sheer, but Drizzt scaled it as easily and as quickly as if it had sported a wide and flat staircase. A group of Myconids fanned out around him as he reached the top, some only half Drizzt's height, but most twice as tall as the drow. Drizzt crossed his arms over his chest, a commonly accepted Underdark signal of peace. The fungus men found Drizzt's appearance disgusting, as disgusting as he considered them, but they did indeed understand that Drizzt had destroyed the basilisk. For many years the Myconids had lived beside the rogue drow, each protecting the life-filled chamber that served as their mutual sanctuary. An oasis such as this place, with edible plants, a stream full of fish, and a herd of Rothe, was not common in the harsh and empty stone caverns of the Underdark, and predators wandering along the outer tunnels invariably found their way in. Then it was left to the fungus men and to Drizzt to defend their domain. The largest of the Myconids moved forward to stand before the dark elf. Drizzt made no move, understanding the importance of establishing an acceptance between himself and the new king of the fungus man colony. Still, Drizzt tensed his muscles, preparing a spring to the side if things did not go as he expected. The Myconid spewed forth a cloud of spores. Drizzt studied them in the split second it took them to descend over him, knowing that the mature myconids could emit many different types of spore, some quite dangerous. But Drizzt recognized the hue of this particular cloud and accepted it wholly. "King dead, me king," came the myconid's thoughts through the telepathic bond inspired by the spore cloud. "You are king," Drizzt responded mentally. How he wished these fungoids could speak aloud. As it was, "Bottom for dark elf, grove for myconid," replied the fungus man. "Agreed. Grove for myconid," the fungus man thought again, this time emphatically. Drizzt silently dropped down off the ledge. He had accomplished his mission with the fungoid. Neither he nor the new king had any desire to continue the meeting. Off at a swift pace, Drizzt leaped the 5-foot-wide stream and padded out across the thick moss. The chamber was longer than it was wide, and it rolled back for many yards, turning a slight bend before it reached the larger exit to the twisting maze of underdark tunnels. Around that bend, Drizzt looked again upon the destruction wreaked by the basilisk. Several half-eaten rothae lay about. Drizzt would have to dispose of those corpses before their stench attracted even more unwelcome visitors. And other rothae stood perfectly still, petrified by the gaze of the dreaded monster. Directly in front of the chamber exit stood the former myconid king, a 12-foot giant, now no more than an ornamental statue. Drizzt paused to regard it. He had never learned the fungoid's name, and had never given it his, but Drizzt supposed that the thing had been his ally at least, perhaps even his friend. They had lived side by side for several years, though they had rarely encountered each other, and both had realized a bit more security just by the other's presence. All told, though, Drizzt felt no remorse at the sight of his petrified ally. In the Underdark, only the strongest survived, and this time the myconid king had not been strong enough. In the wilds of the Underdark, failure allowed for no second chance. Out in the tunnels again, Drizzt felt his rage beginning to build. He welcomed it fully, focusing his thoughts on the carnage in his domain and accepting the anger as an ally in the wilds. He came through a series of tunnels and turned into the one where he had placed his darkness spell the night before, where Guinevere had crouched, ready to spring upon the basilisk. Drizzt's spell was long gone now, and using his infravision, he could make out several warm, glowing forms crawling over the cooling mound that Drizzt knew to be the dead monster. The sight of the thing only heightened the hunter's rage. Instinctively, he grasped the hilt of one of his scimitars. As though it moved of its own accord, the weapon shot out as Drizzt passed the basilisk's head, splatting sickeningly into the exposed brains. Several blind cave rats took flight at the sound, and Drizzt, again without thinking, snapped off a thrust with his second blade, pinning one to the stone. Without even slowing his pace, he scooped the rat up and dropped it into his pouch. Finding the rothae could be a tedious process, and the hunter would need to eat. For the remainder of that day and half of the next, the hunter moved out away from his domain.
It's not going too
The
bad.
cave rat was not a particularly enjoyable meal, but it sustained Drizzt, allowing him to continue, allowing him to survive. To the hunter in the Underdark, nothing else mattered. That second day out, the hunter knew he was closing in on a group of his lost beasts. He summoned Guinevere to his side, and with the panther's help, had little trouble finding the rothae. Drizzt had hoped that all of the herd would still be together, but he found only a half-dozen in the area. 6 were better than none, though, and Drizzt set Guinevere into motion, herding the rothae back toward the moss cave. Drizzt set a brutal pace, knowing that the task would be much easier and safer with Guinevere by his side. By the time the panther tired and had to return to its home plain, the rothae were comfortably grazing by the familiar stream. The drow set out again immediately, this time taking 2 dead rats along for the ride. He called Guinevere again when he was able, and dismissed the panther when he had to. Then again after that, as the days rolled by without further sign. But the hunter did not surrender his search. Frightened rothae could cover an incredible amount of ground, and in the maze of twisting tunnels and huge caverns, the hunter knew that many more days could pass before he caught up to the beasts. Drizzt found his food where he could, taking down a bat with a perfect throw of a dagger after tossing up a deceptive screen of pebbles and dropping a boulder onto the back of a giant underdark crab. Eventually, Drizzt grew weary of the search and longed for the security of his small cave. Doubting that the Rothe, running blind, could have survived this long out in the tunnels, so far from their water and food, he accepted his herd's loss and decided to return home via a route that would bring him back to the region of the Moss Cavern from a different direction. Only the clear tracks of his lost herd would detour him from his set course, Drizzt decided. But as he rounded a bend halfway home, a strange sound caught his attention and held it. Drizzt pressed his hands against the stone, feeling the subtle, rhythmical vibrations.
I'll
A
be
short
right
distance
back.
away, something banged the stone in succession, measured, hammering. The hunter drew his scimitars and crept along, using the continuing vibrations to guide him through the winding passageways. The flickering light of a fire dropped him into a crouch, but he did not flee, drawn by the knowledge that an intelligent being was nearby. Quite possibly the stranger would prove to be a threat, but perhaps, Drizzt hoped in the back of his mind, it could be something more than that. Then Drizzt saw them. Two banging at the stone with crafted pickaxes, another collecting rubble in a wheelbarrow, and two more standing guard. The hunter knew at once that more guards would be about. He probably had penetrated their defenses without even seeing them. Drizzt summoned one of the abilities of his heritage and drifted slowly up into the air, guiding his levitation with his hands along the stone. Luckily, the tunnel was high at this point, so the hunter could observe the mining creatures in relative safety. They were shorter than Drizzt and hairless, with squat and muscled torsos perfectly designed for the mining that was their calling in life. Drizzt had encountered this race before, and had learned much of them during his years at the academy back in Menzoberranzan. These were Zwerfnebli, deep gnomes, the most hated enemies of the Drow in all the Underdark. Once, long ago, Drizzt had led a Drow patrol into battle against a group of Zwerfnebli, and personally had defeated an earth elemental that the deep gnome leader had summoned. Drizzt remembered that time now, and like all of the memories of his existence, the thoughts pained him. He had been captured by the deep gnomes, roughly tied and held prisoner in a secret chamber. The Zwerfnebli had not mistreated him, though they suspected, and explained to Drizzt that they would eventually have to kill him. The group's leader had promised Drizzt as much mercy as the situation allowed. Drizzt's comrades, though, led by Denon, his own brother, had stormed in, showing the deep gnomes no mercy at all. Drizzt had managed to convince his brother to spare the Zwerfneblin leader's life, but Denon, showing typical Drow cruelty, had ordered the deep gnome's hands severed before releasing him to flee to his homeland. Drizzt shook himself from the anguishing memories and forced his thoughts back to the situation at hand. Deep gnomes could be formidable adversaries, he reminded himself, and they would not likely welcome a Drow elf to their mining operations. He had to keep alert. The miners apparently had struck a rich vein, for they began talking in excited tones. Drizzt reveled in the sound of those words, though he could not begin to understand the strange gnomish language. A smile not inspired by victory in battle found its way onto Drizzt's face for the first time in years, as the Zwerfnebli scrambled about the stone, tossing huge chunks into their wheelbarrows and calling for other nearby companions to come and join in the fun. As Drizzt had suspected, more than a dozen unseen Zwerfnebli came in from every direction. Drizzt found a high perch against the wall and watched the miners long after his levitation spell had expired. When at last their wheelbarrows were overfilled, the deep gnomes formed a column and started away. Drizzt realized that his prudent course at that time would be to let them get far away, then slip back to his home. But, against the simple logic that guided his survival, Drizzt found that he could not so easily let the sound of the voices get away. He picked his way down the high wall and fell into pace behind the Zwerfneblin caravan, wondering where it would lead. For many days Drizzt followed the deep gnomes. He resisted the temptation to summon Guinevere, knowing that the panther could use the extended rest, and himself satisfied in the company, however distant, of the deep gnome's chatter. Every instinct warned the hunter against continuing in his actions, But for the first time in a very long time, Drizzt overruled the instincts of his more primal self. He needed to hear the gnomish voices more than he needed the simple necessities of survival. The corridors became more worked, less natural around him, and Drizzt knew that he was approaching the Zwerfnebelin homeland. Again, the potential dangers loomed up before him, and again he dismissed them as secondary. He quickened his pace and put the mining caravan in sight, suspecting that the Zwerfnebli would have some cunning trap set about. The deep gnomes measured their steps at this point, taking care to avoid certain areas. Drizzt carefully mimicked their movements and nodded knowingly as he noticed a loose stone here and a low tripwire there. Then Drizzt ducked back behind an outcropping as new voices joined the sound of the miners. The mining troop had come to a long and wide stairway, ascending between two walls of absolutely sheer and uncracked stone. To the side of the stair was an opening barely high and wide enough for the wheelbarrows, and Drizzt watched with sincere admiration as the deep gnome miners moved the carts to this opening and fastened the lead one to a chain. A series of taps on the stone sent a signal to an unseen operator, and the chain creaked, drawing the wheelbarrow into the hole. One by one, the carts disappeared, and the Zwerfnebelin band thinned as well, taking to the stairs as their load lessened. As the two remaining deep gnomes hitched the last cart to the chain and tapped out the signal, Drizzt took a gamble born of desperation. He waited for the deep gnomes to turn their backs and darted to the cart, catching it just as it disappeared into the low tunnel. Drizzt understood the depth of his foolishness when the last deep gnome, still apparently unaware of his presence, replaced a stone at the bottom of the passage, blocking any possible retreat. The chain pulled on, and the cart rolled up at an angle as steep as the paralleling staircase. Drizzt could see nothing ahead, for the wheelbarrow, designed for a perfect fit, took up the entire height and width of the tunnel. Drizzt noticed then that the cart had little wheels along its sides as well, aiding in its passage. It felt so good to be in the presence of such intelligence again, but Drizzt could not ignore the danger surrounding him. The Zwerfnebli would not take well to an intruding drow elf. It was likely they would strike out with weapons, not questions. After several minutes, the passage leveled off and widened. A single Zwerfnebelin was there, effortlessly turning the crank that hauled up the wheelbarrows. Intent on his business, the deep gnome did not notice Drizzt's dark form dart from behind the last cart and silently slip through the room's side door. Drizzt heard voices as soon as he opened the door. He continued ahead, though, having nowhere else to go, and dropped to his belly on a narrow ledge. The deep gnomes, guards and miners were below him, talking on a landing at the top of the wide stairway. At least a score stood there now, the miners recounting the tales of their rich find. At the back of the landing, through two immense and partly ajar metal-bound stone doors, Drizzt caught a glimpse of the Zwerfnebelin city. The drow could see but a fraction of the place, and that not very well from his position on the ledge, but he guessed that the cavern beyond those massive doors was not nearly as large as the chamber housing Menzo Baranzon. Drizzt wanted to go in there. He wanted to jump up and rush through those doors, give himself over to the deep gnomes for whatever judgment they deemed fair. Perhaps they would accept him. Perhaps they would see Drizzt Do'Urden for who he truly was. The Zwerfnebli on the landing, laughing and chatting, made their way into the city. Drizzt had to go now, had to spring up and follow them beyond the massive doors. But the hunter, the being who had survived a decade in the savage wilds of the Underdark, could not move from the ledge. The hunter, the being who had defeated a basilisk and countless other of this dangerous world's monsters, could not give himself over in the hopes of civilized mercy. The hunter did not understand such concepts. The massive stone doors closed, and the moment of flickering light in Drizzt's darkening heart died with a resounding crash. After a long and tormented moment, Drizzt Do'Urden rolled off the ledge and dropped to the landing at the top of the stairs. His vision blurred suddenly as he made his way down, the path away from the teeming life beyond the doors. And it was only the primal instincts of the hunter that sensed the presence of still more Zwerfnebelin guards. The hunter leaped wildly over the startled deep gnomes and rushed out again into the freedom offered by the wild Underdark's open passageways. When he had put the Zwerfneblin city far behind, Drizzt reached into his pocket and took out the statuette, the summons to his only companion. A moment later, though, Drizzt dropped the figurine back, refusing to call the cat, punishing himself for his weakness on the ledge. If he had been stronger on the ledge beside the immense doors, he could have put an end to his torment, one way or another. The instincts of Hunter battled Drizzt for control as he made his way along the passages that would take him back to the moss-filled cavern. As the Underdark and the press of undeniable danger continued to close in around him, those primal, alert instincts took command, denying any further distracting thoughts of the Zwerfnebli and their city. Those primal instincts were the salvation and the damnation of Drizzt Do'Urden. 3. Snakes and Swords. How many 10 days has it been? Dinan signaled to Breeza in the silent hand code of the Drow. How many 10 days have we hunted through these tunnels for our renegade brother? Dinan's expression revealed his sarcasm as he motioned the thoughts. Breeza scowled at him and did not reply. She cared for this tedious duty even less than he. She was a high priestess of Lolth and had been the eldest daughter, accorded a high place of honor within the family structure. Never before would Breeza have been sent off on such a hunt, but now, for some unexplained reason, Sinefe Hunnet had joined the family, relegating Breeza to a lesser position. 5? Dinan continued, his anger growing with each darting movement of his slender fingers. 6? How long has it been, sister? He pressed. How long has Shinena been sitting at Matron Malice's side? Breeza's snake-headed whip came off her belt, and she spun angrily on her brother. Dinan, realizing that he had gone too far with his sarcastic prodding, defensively drew his sword and tried to duck away. Breeza's strike came faster, easily defeating Dinan's pitiful attempt at a parry, and 3 of the 6 heads connected squarely on the elder boy Do'Urden's chest and shoulder. Cold pain spread through Dinan's body, leaving only a helpless numbness in its wake. His sword arm dropped, and he started to topple forward. Breeza's powerful hand shot out and caught him by the throat as he swooned, easily lifting him onto his toes. Then, looking around at the other 5 members of the hunting party to ensure that none were moving in Dinan's favor, Breeza slammed her stunned brother roughly into the stone wall. The high priestess leaned heavily on Dinan, one hand tight against his throat. A wise male would measure his gestures more carefully, Breeza snarled aloud, though she and the others had been explicitly instructed by Matron Malice not to communicate in any method other than the silent code once they were beyond Menzo Baranzon's borders. It took Dinan a long while to fully appreciate his predicament. As the
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone keep stopping by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.